1 p.m. All right, welcome to one of our events on the first day of the Platypus International Convention for 2022. So I'm Chris Catrone. I'm going to moderate this panel on the legacy of the 1980s left. Just very briefly, actually I don't have the bios. Nobody gave me the bios. Okay. But I do have basically to my right Douglas Lain, who is a former editor at Zero Books and now embarking upon a new multimedia project, Sublation Media, also formerly of Diet Soap Media.
Don't forget I'm a novelist.
Indeed. No, it's true. Indeed, maybe that's the first passion and enduring profession is as a writer. James Heartfield, hi. James, how shall I introduce you? a storied biography at this point.
Were you going to ask me or what?
Yes, I'm asking. I am.
I was active in the far left in the 1980s in the Revolutionary Communist Party, and more recently I've been involved in the Brexit campaign in Britain, and I write histories mostly and some political books.
Unpatriotic history of World War II. Yes, indeed.
And I published some of your work when I was at Zero, and so did the people who worked there before me, I want to point out.
They did, and I'm very pleased.
Yeah.
Adoni Methylopolis, longtime member of Platypus. Adoni, maybe you should introduce yourself.
I live in Oregon, and previously to Platypus, I was involved with the New Democratic Party, the provincial wing of the Alberta Party.
In Canada. Okay, so Lance. And Lance Selfa. Maybe Lance, if you can introduce yourself briefly.
Okay, I hope you can hear me. Okay, great. Well, what I said, I been an active socialist since the early 1980s when I was a member of the International Socialist Organization. I'm now working with the International Socialist Project. I've written the book, The Democrats, A Critical History, and I edited a book on the aftermath of the Trump election a few years back. And I just want to thank everyone for doing all the extra effort that they did to allow me to take part in this panel. Thanks a lot.
Thanks. So to introduce the panel briefly, the description reads as follows. We invite the panelists to reflect upon the trajectories of their personal political development. How were you politicized? What was your experience being on the left in the 1980s like? What specifically did the 1980s left inherit from the 1960s and 70s new left and even earlier generations of the left? What made it necessary or unnecessary to invoke and reinscribe Marxism in the 1980s? How did neoliberalism and the Cold War affect the tasks set forth for the left at that time? From the standpoint of 2022, what did the 1980s left amount to? So I'm going to ask our panelists to each speak for about 10 to 12 minutes. And we will proceed in the same order in which I introduced the panelists. So we'll start with Doug Lain.
Okay, so I just answered these questions from my own personal recollection without worrying about whether my recollection had any merit. This is more of a confession than it is anything else. But the thing to know is that in 1980 I was 9 years old. And so when I think about the left in the 80s, it's a pretty tricky proposition. Instead of thinking about the left, I just think about my development of an understanding of politics. And what I can recall is one of my earliest memories is of the Iranian hostage crisis, and it was a problem that the adults couldn't handle. My Uncle Jim Gibb was visiting my parents in Colorado, and it was a subject of conversation. And when I asked for an explanation of just what was going on, my uncle said, "Don't worry, your father is going to make sure everything is okay." Which I thought was a strange answer, particularly because my father looked surprised by it. And I knew it was a lie and that things weren't working out the way that everyone thought they should. But what really politicized me as a child was the threat of nuclear war. I lived in Colorado Springs, which was near NORAD, so it was on all of our minds, as we would be vaporized if mutual assured destruction happened. And it was a renewed fear under Ronald Reagan in general. Growing up as the son of a doctor, I didn't really have want for anything, but I did notice in school, this is another aspect of my political development, that there were divisions in my classmates. Some of my friends lived on the wrong streets. There was a street called Nevada in Colorado Springs in particular where there was government housing. And I tended to make friends with those kids, not out of any sense of moral obligation, but because I was a bit odd and these were the kids who might socialize with me. Despite this, here's what I wrote here. Still, despite trying to get my teachers and fellow students to sign a petition against nuclear weapons when I was maybe 12, it really wasn't until 1991 that I was politicized. It was the Gulf War, the fact that we were resorting to armed conflict. The United States was engaged in an armed conflict with a foe who, even back then, was touted as a possible nuclear threat that moved me to be a leftist eventually. But I wasn't a leftist in the 80s. I was a Democrat in a conservative city. I supported Michael Dukakis, or told my friends I did. I also, though, supported Bill and Opus in 1988, cartoon, nobody remembers him. When I was 17, the 60s were kind of a dream of rebellion that I believed had been snuffed out before I was born. And the 70s, in my memory, was defined by like disco and President Carter and polyester. The 60s might have seemed like a decade of free sex and the Paris Commune in comparison if I'd known about the Paris Commune. So to repeat, to be on the left in the 80s, for me, meant being a frightened and powerless Democrat. Ronald Reagan, or Reaganism, was poised to last forever, while people like me were destined to listen to Tracy Chapman whispering, while admiring PBS documentaries about the People's Park and Abby Hoffman from the comfort of a childhood bedroom decorated with Beatles posters and eventually a scattering of Z magazines. I didn't discover Marx, and by that I mean overcome my anti-Marxism until much later. In the early 90s, when I was in my 20s, the closest I got to Marx was when I read Guy Debord, an anti-Bolshevik theorist and artist and drunk. If we can stretch the 80s until 1992, I have something to say about the left in the 80s. Starting with the Gulf War, coming after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Soviet Union. That was what made me a leftist, and it seemed to me that the Gulf War was an unnecessary show of force from a US empire that was dedicated to continuing to exert its influence around the globe. It was proof that the Cold War had been about US power and US violence for its own sake rather than any sincere effort to contain a totalitarian and authoritarian enemy. And that's what made me, when I kind of came to this conclusion with some help from people like Noam Chomsky, that's what made me long for a movement. The war, we were told that I was afraid of what would happen with the war. We were told that Saddam had secret nuclear weapons, and so I felt in peril and wanted to find a left that could help put the world right, make it a more peaceful place. And that was a moment when I broke from the manufactured consent of America. I declared myself an anarchist and created a zine called Diet Soap, which lives on today as a podcast. So it was Guy Debord and Noam Chomsky who shaped my political consciousness in the 90s, or let's call it the late 80s. They're different temperaments, different kinds of people, but they had a similar outlook. The media was the problem. They were brainwashing Americans, making us all stupid and complacent and racist and fat. The spectacle, in the European context, was dominating the world, making us all helpless and crazy and passive, and generally turning us all into Americans. This shift from the fear of nuclear war to hatred for the spectacle and a love for the invisible left movement was, I think, a positive step, actually. It was my way to come of age and to pursue an artistic practice. And I wrote some fiction based on these kind of ideas with titles like The Sea Monkey Conspiracy and The Brainwash Brand, and even Noam Chomsky and the Magic Mushroom, which was later retitled Chomsky in the Time Box, and was published in Inner Zone magazine. You can check it out. So after the Gulf War, it was neoliberalism, Reaganism as ratified by Clinton. That was the enemy. That was the spectacle. Individualist anarchism turned against the globalists, against civilization itself. We renounced politics as just another trick, another media lie, and dreamed of ways we might escape. That is, those of us who didn't just enjoy the boom of the 90s and go to work, those of us who entered the arts or scrounged out a lifestyle, or who watched with wonder as Timothy Leary reappeared to tout the computer networks that were just as good as acid. We fought the spectacle in the late 80s or 90s, and we weren't sure what we were going to do. Maybe we would become cyberpunks, or maybe we would live off the grid. Either one of those sounded like a good option, as long as we made sure to re-elect Clinton along the way. In 1999, the anti-spectacle, anti-neoliberal movement that would be represented by John Cerzan and Crime Think in the Pacific Northwest had its moment. So like the 80s bleeding into the 90s had their moment in Seattle. Windows were smashed. The WTO conference was disrupted, and the idea that anti-capitalism might have some sort of hold on a kind of left seemed possible. That is, until Bush Jr. arrived and Reagan was back, and only this time he really was Hitler. And in the 21st century, the anarchists turning 30 had to run. The cops were coming. The stupid masses had turned on us. The evil ones were running the show, and it was time to return to the streets, but this time with our love beads on, and it was time, of course, to vote for the Democrats once again. So that's my summary of that.
James?
Okay, so that's quite all right. I thought before getting bogged down in biographical detail that well, I'm about to, that I'd do my conclusion, which is my judgment would be that the 1980s were a time when the left stopped being revolutionary and became conservative, small c conservative, let me say, being English, meaning that they were largely interested in defending the gains of the past rather than, I think you got to start because you put me off, defending the gains of the post-war era as opposed to overthrowing them. And the right, by contrast, had become I don't want to say revolutionaries because that would be giving them too much credence, but they certainly were committed to tearing apart all of that post-war compromise, the corporatist state as we understood it, the social democratic compact that Britain had been run under throughout the post-war period. And that, I think, was, so that would be my assessment, is that the left became somewhat conservative and the right became, on the face of it, a lot more dramatically revolutionary. Autobiography is weird because it introduces all kinds of arbitrary elements, and I can't say that I worked towards the position of revolution. I was actually, my parents were beatniks. You know, if you see the pictures of them, they really did have black turtleneck sweaters and granny glasses. They were art students. My father, Patrick Hughes, still a working artist, and they were associated with the Fluxus group. Yoko Ono, I think, was the most famous participant in that. Robin Page was a art teacher at Leeds University at the time, and they were really committed not to revolutionizing all human experience and overthrowing even perception and revolutionizing everything. In which I should say that a small component of that, as in my parents' mind, might have been to overthrow capitalism, but that was a subplot to the big thing. And I always thought they might be mildly disappointed that me and my brother got involved in Trotskyism, which they probably thought was a rather mediocre and modest ambition compared to their own commitment to transforming everything. That was interesting. I mean, I learned a lot. You know, they were interesting people. So I remember early on, you know, there was a long discussion around my kitchen table about why abstract expressionism was an elevation of stupidity and the spontaneous in a way that was a monstrous betrayal of the creative endeavour. Which was great, you know, as a kid to see this argument unfolding, and I kind of forgot that, as you would. And then years later, I'd be discussing, as I was in the 1980s, Lenin's What Is to Be Done, trying to understand the politics of the 1980s through the prism of Bolshevism with a group of like-minded people. I get onto the section about the swamp. You know, people, if you read this, the Lenin on the swamp. And my comrades were all like, I don't get this. And I thought, this is obvious. This is like falling off a tree to me. This is easy. It's just the same as the problem of abstract expressionism, elevation of spontaneity. And then years later, I repurposed much of those arguments when we wrote about postmodernism and what postmodernism meant in terms of its retreat from the possibilities of rational engagement. So I did learn a lot from them, but I also went to a lot of happenings and things like that, which was an interesting childhood. But it was a peculiar road into the 1980s. I'd say the story of the 1980s, I arrived in London in 1980 as a student at the Middlesex Polytechnic. And it was intense violence all around. There was race riots unfolding all over London, Bristol and Liverpool. There was an actual war taking place in Northern Ireland with bombs going off in London. It was fabulously exciting, I want to say. It wasn't scary at all. I mean, I was an idiot, obviously, but because I was 18. But to me, it felt like the revolution was here and practical and real. And that, I think, was deluded somewhat, because the truth was that a lot of the bitterness and stupidity of that time was because, in large part, the militancy of the 1970s was in retreat. And what we were really experiencing was the gradual isolation And you would meet these fabulous characters, thinking of the inheritance of the 1960s. And I met loads of characters that we now talk with great reverence, for example, of the historian and activist C.L.R. James. And I'm always amazed to read, now you buy his books, and they're big university press publications. But I remember buying them, they'd be like these really cheap knockoff editions that he'd more or less printed. And he was living in this bedsit with that Farouk Dondi had got for him. And the Race Today collective, really interesting people. But they were like wrecks, they were, as a group of people, you wouldn't have thought they were going to make a revolution, because they were isolated. They were very talented people, but they were really, you'd meet the Hackney Black People's Collective. The same with the Irish struggle, where there was these superb characters that you would meet over and over again, like Finbar O'Doherty. I don't know if anybody's read Eamon McCann's fabulous War in an Irish Town. There's this superb character, Finbar O'Doherty, who jumps down from the balcony of the the London Derry City Council, and announces himself the first citizen of Derry, and starts issuing these edicts. And it's a great picture of the civil rights movement in full flush. And I can remember helping to organise meetings where he was speaking at the Hackney Labour Club, and he was a fabulous character, but he was out of place. His movement had ebbed away. Even the Republican movement kind of spat him out in all slightly unpleasant ways. And there was that closing down, taking place. The people I fell in with, who the most important of them I remember were Frank Furedi, who'd been a student in Canada, in Toronto, and he'd moved to London. He got a teaching job at Sussex. Michael Fitzpatrick was from the Sheffield Irish contingent, and they were organising this conference called Workers Against Imperialism. I thought this was brilliant, because this thing was happening in Northern Ireland was very important to us, and we organised campaigns around race attacks in East London with this campaign called East London Workers Against Racism, and organised this party. But we thought of it as a party, but I think in a sense it wasn't. The Revolutionary Communist, at first it was called the Revolutionary Communist Tendency, which we used to get our leg. You thought Platypus was bad, but to be called the Revolutionary Communist Tendency always had a bit like one of those Pope rhyming couplets, where it starts very dramatic but it ends with tendency. So we had to. The thinking was that, and I think this was a superb insight on Frank Furedi's part, was that in essence his judgment was there was no Marxist tradition to defend, and he wrote that in a pamphlet, I think it was called Artas and Methods. There was no revolutionary tradition to defend. So, and that was a great release. The only comparable thing I can remember was when Johnny Rotten said, "It's great to be ugly," which was a superb thing to say to an 18-year-old boy, because you always thought you were ugly, and then it's great to be ugly, and I'm released. And not having to save the Marxist tradition was a fabulous moment of release, because it seemed to me, all politics was about saving what was, and we were saying, no, scrap it, start again. If revolutionary Marxism is going to work, it's got to rebuild from the ground up. Don't try and save the Communist Party. Don't try and save the Labour Party. Let's try and build something else. And that was what we did. We tried to build something else. It was an experiment. I think, in essence, the experiment failed. I mean, it's not failure in the sense that you learn, but I think we really, the hope was that with all the excuses gone, with the prospect of reformism no longer practicable, with the capitalism in its in a very down period, that there could be a clearing of the way, and there might be a possibility that you could win a working class to a revolutionary program. I think the truth was that what we discovered was that the conservative impulse overwhelmed that most, understandably, I don't think this is wicked or bad or anything, I don't think it's a fault of working people, but they were naturally in a position where all the attacks against them took the form of stripping away the protections, the minimal protections that welfareism and all the rest of it had, and that their trade unions were being slowly battered down by anti-trade union laws and aggressive employers, and that the instinct was to preserve and to hang on, and that really was a losing road. I think that was the key thing. It was a losing path. That every time that we, the left, or the British Labour Party and the radical left, set itself the project of trying to defend what existed, they would invariably lose. They would fail to defend what existed because they were already on the defensive, and it meant that they were always taking a step back. So I think we learned that the problem was a lot bigger than we hoped that it would be, but also that which I think was right, and I'll defend it to this day, that the Labour Party's reformist project was never going to defend working people in Britain, and that the radical left, the revolutionary Marxist left, had unfortunately lost sight of the prospect of what it ought to have been, which was a movement of revolutionary transformation, where it had become largely a sort of verbal revolution with a practical conservative edge.
Adoni?
Thank you very much. Okay, mine, I apologize, are written out. Two British New Left intellectuals, Fred Halliday and Tariq Ali, found themselves at a fork in the road in the mid-1980s. For Halliday, the 1960s New Left offered the opportunity to reconsider the long-neglected tasks of Marxism. In his 1970 translation of Karl Korsch's Marxism and Philosophy, he optimistically wrote in the foreword, "It is the reemergence of revolutionary class politics in advanced capitalist society of the West today that has revived interest in Korsch's work and provides an opportunity for Marxists to critically reassess it." The moment of reassessing Korsch and the crisis of Marxism in the Second International more broadly did not survive the 1980s. In 1983, Halliday had left the editorial board of the New Left Review along with 7 other board members, including Juliet Mitchell. He had watched with dismay as Marxist organizations that were built up over the 1970s provided ideological cover for the liquidation of the Iranian left in the 1979 revolution. Soon after, these same groups were calling on Soviet troops to withdraw from Afghanistan under the slogan, "Against imperialism, East and West." Imperialism, as with all other categories arising from Marxism in the early 20th century, had lost its critical dimension. It was no longer a way of understanding the unmet potential within society as it had been expressed in Korsch's time. By the 1980s, it was patently clear imperialism would be used to justify the left's helplessness, a feature of anti-imperialism that would outlive the Cold War, as Moïse Postone would remark decades later. Tailing behind actual events, the New Left Review appeared to Halliday as a self-appointed general staff without any troops at our command. Like Moïse Postone or Adolph Reed, those who attempted to rediscover the critical core of the Marxist project in the New Left, Halliday viewed the 1970s sectarian organization as the embodiment of the failure of the decade. Notably, Tariq Ali came through a sectarian organization, the Pabloite International Marxist Group. But his association with the IMG did not survive the 1980s. Like Halliday, Ali could feel the growing isolation of these groups and the reduced prospects of Marxist politics. In 1981, he left the IMG to join the Labour Party in support of Tony Benn's bid for deputy leader. Ali defended his decision, stating, "Even if all the far-left groups were united, they would still not be as strong, especially in terms of proletarian cadre, as was the Communist Party of the 20s. Halliday recounted this fork in the road in an interview with Danny Postel in 2005, titled, "Who is Responsible?" About 20 years ago, I said to Tariq that God, Allah, called the two of us to his presence and said to us, one of you go to the left and one of you to go to the right. The problem is, he didn't tell us which was which, and maybe he didn't know himself. What Halliday and Ali share was the disorientation that accompanied the 1980s, after which the historical consciousness of the left became so degraded that it became difficult to discern left from right. In 1985, Halliday gave up the Marxist dialectic and settled into a professorship in the International Relations Department at the London School of Economics. Ali turned away from the model of the 1920s Communist parties, taking inspiration instead from the resistance in the Vietnam War in his embrace of the World Social Forum. Neither of these figures were willing to take responsibility for their attempts at Marxism in the 1970s. The failure of the 70s left my generation ill-equipped for the transformation of the 80s. My political life became an amalgam of anarchism and social democracy, which frequently reinforced one another in a division of labor. My earliest political memory was the watershed 1984 Canadian federal election campaign by the... There's my mom. She's listening. That's not how it happened, Adoni, I'm telling you. Okay. All right. Okay, my earliest political memory was, and she was there, was the watershed 1984 Canadian federal electoral campaign by the New Democratic Party. The leader, Ed Broadbent, called for the deepening of the welfare state and less American ownership of the Canadian economy. The sentiment was echoed by the Canadian auto workers the following year when they broke with the UAW to protect negotiated annual wage increases against the deep restructuring of the auto sector in the US. The Canadians rejected pegging wage increases to the profitability of the firm on principle, even if it meant losing jobs. They saw the move as upholding the spirit of the International. A portrait of UAW President Walter Reuther hung prominently in the office of CAW President Bob White. As Lance has written in his excellent book, Reuther played a pivotal role in integrating labor into the Democratic New Deal coalition. In doing so, I think Lance provides a much-needed corrective to the notion that the integration of labor into the New Deal was itself a step towards socialism. But perhaps this integration was also a new potential for socialism, one that the 1980s left was unable to advance. Under Reuther, the UAW support for the civil rights movement laid the basis for the increased size of the labor force by broadening its racial, ethnic, and gender composition. The legacy being, in neoliberalism, the devaluing of labor, something that would accelerate on a massive scale with the opening of the Chinese labor market in the 1990s. Perhaps the 1980s provided an opportunity for Marxists to take responsibility of the crisis of the New Deal, a crisis that they themselves had a hand in precipitating through the New Left. Why couldn't the growing ranks of workers internationally be turned into an opportunity to build on the Marxism of the 1970s? Even if the left was too small to lead the crisis, as Tariq Ali had noted, perhaps that insight alone would have better served a young Gen Xer like myself to prepare me for the 1990s. Perhaps just knowing we're in a situation that Draper recognized in the 1970s, namely as a non-pre-revolutionary period, would have been the way to take responsibility for Marxism against the exodus that took place in the 1980s. Because decisively, in 1981, Reagan's first year in office, he went on the offensive, attacking the Democratic-controlled public sector unions, breaking a strike by the air traffic controllers by firing almost 12,000 employees. He also provoked a recession to break a decade of inflation, low growth, and instability. His re-election slogan in 1984, which I remember, was stability returning. It's morning again in America. The restructuring of the North American auto sector was to follow and the Canada-US free trade deal, which I opposed vehemently in 1987, and its extension to Mexico in 1992 under NAFTA. As the Cold War came to an end, trade liberalization for the first time exceeded levels of the pre-1914 world. Reagan even appealed to workers who saw the Japanese auto sector overtake the US in the late 1970s. Reagan promised to uphold the rights of work against the constituency rackets of the New Deal. The left was in a state of shock. What remained of the small new political and civil social institutions created during the 70s hysterically reoriented to resist Reagan? Here I'm reminded of the reworked version of California Über Alles by the San Francisco punk band The Dead Kennedys. The song was originally written in 1979 for the Democratic California governor Jerry Brown and conveyed the fascist quality of the 1960s hippie demographic that had sold out as they'd become yuppies. It was reissued in 1981 upon Reagan's election as "We've got bigger problems now." The punk rage against fascist hippies effortlessly slid into the new fascism of the new conservative and their Bible Belt moral majority. Any potential for the 1980s was lost in the single-minded pursuit of the bigger problem, never a working through of older lingering ones. Certainly this quality of the left predates Generation X, but the 1980s marked a condition of senile dementia when it came to the left's own history. In its wake were zigzag and flip-flops that left no residue of bad conscience because no organization exists to register the compromises, only organizations to defeat Republicans. Certainly this rudderless resistance is what I encountered in the 1990s in the form of anarchism. This anarchism was not in the spirit of building up new, independent civil social organizations against the state, but paradoxically, resistance to defend institutions that were already passing. As Christian Williams noted in the Platypus Review, quote, "The disorientation around the welfare state was compounded in the 1990s with Clinton in the White House and Gingrich in the House of Representatives, and Clinton running on the promise of ending welfare as we know it. Obviously, the food stamps and social worker version of providing for people's needs isn't what anarchists want. But nevertheless, that participated such a crisis in anarchism that it put a lot of us on the side of defending those services, needing to defend that kind of spending." Against my generation and its anarchism, the millennials had an opportunity to reconsider Marxism and build organizations that could orient themselves to the global financial crisis of 2008. It was a tall order, given the decades of neglect, one that was improbable, but not impossible. But the 1980s resistance to Reagan was repeated under Trump, even as he shared our sentiment on NAFTA as being the worst trade deal in the history of the world. Ironically, it was Trump, not my generation, that dealt the decisive blow to the Reagan coalition. But just as my generation missed the conditions for transformation within neoliberalism, the millennials let their own moment pass as neoliberalism fell into crisis, and in the process, Marxism was to skip yet another generation. Thank you.
Okay, Lance.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, good. Thanks again for people who were able to make this happen. I know it was kind of an extra effort in the end there, but thanks that we're able to do it. I want to start out by saying I'm not a big fan of autobiography as it regards one's role in a political movement or organizations. Those experiences are inherently collective, and therefore your politicization and political development is bound up with other people's. But for what it's worth, I was probably typical enough as someone who joined the socialist movement in college in the early 1980s. One of my first experiences with activism was in organizing against registration for the military draft, which the Carter administration had brought back in 1978, if I remember right, as part of the U.S. shift to the new Cold War with the USSR in the late 70s and early 80s. I mean, for the next few years, as an undergraduate at Northwestern, I was involved in various progressive causes through Amnesty International, later in the solidarity movements with the Central American revolutions in Nicaragua and El Salvador, and the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. And around that time, I came in contact with different socialist groups. In fact, I joined a study group on the Communist Manifesto that was led by David Roediger, people might have heard of, labor historian, who was a prof at Northwestern at the time and was working with the anti-apartheid group. And I became more interested in learning about Marxism, socialism, and thinking about joining a socialist group. Now, one thing I will say about the left of that time was that even though the post-1960s radicalization, as a number of the speakers have already referred to, that it had peaked and many of the groups that started at that time were shrinking, there was still a number of them around. So you got used to going to events, as we would call running a gauntlet of newspaper sellers from different groups. Now, a lot of people then and now would look at this as representative of kind of small group sectarianism that, Monty Python satirized in The Life of Brian, the competitions between the Judean People's Front and the People's Front of Judea, and then the one guy who couldn't be in any other group, so he formed his own. But the one thing that you would consider was that when you were doing that, you had to actually decide, if you're going to be a socialist, what made this group different from the other one, and why would you join it? And that's especially true for a period when different organizations, mostly I would characterize as Stalinist or Maoist, looked to various so-called socialist countries like the Soviet Union, China, Albania, Cuba, etc. So you had to answer for yourself if those countries or organizations represented for socialism for you. Now, for me, who joined the International Socialist Organization in 1982, officially actually joined only a few blocks from where you all are gathering right now, what was it in the ISO's politics that came to make sense to me? And what did that have to do with the times? Now, the IS and the International Socialist tendency that it was part of stood apart from most of the rest of the left, including most of the Trotskyist left, on its insistence that the USSR and other Stalinist countries were examples of what it called state capitalism rather than socialism. We also adhered to a slogan of neither Washington nor Moscow, but revolutionary socialism from below. And it became clear to me during the mass workers' uprising in Poland that produced the Solidarity movement. Solidarity at that time, the Solidarność movement, raised the elemental question of what side were you on, the workers' side or the Stalinist bureaucracy side? Now, Solidarity evolved to, in a number of different directions after that. But I think at that time, the ISO and the IS tendency picked the right side, that's the side of the workers. And in fact, there's a book of the IS tendency called Workers Against the Monolith, which actually talks about workers' uprisings inside the so-called socialist countries. So that probably more than any other political development of that time drove me and other comrades around me to IS politics, international socialist politics. This might be a good segue to the question of what the 1980s left inherited from the earlier generations of the left. Now, I joined the socialist movement when I was a student, but I particularly or especially wanted to be in an organization that would be involved in movements and struggles off the campus. And here I think that's what attracted me to socialist politics and to learn from people who were already active in that movement. In the ISO's early years, we benefited from education we received from leading figures in the British Socialist Workers' Party, people like Tony Cliff, Duncan Hallis, Chris Harman, Lindsey German, among others. And they provided or helped to provide the foundation for our understanding of the politics of international socialism. For more than a decade after the ISO's founding in 1977, following its expulsion from the International Socialist US, the 1930s era UAW activist and revolutionary John Anderson wrote a regular column on working class politics and socialist worker. Some of the leading activists who helped to form the predecessor of what has become the Teamsters for a Democratic Union were also founders of the ISO. So we had some sense of a working class socialist tradition that we were standing in. Now that's a kind of narrow take on the particular part of the left that I associate with. But at least in the early 90s, the early 80s, there was enough of a memory of the 1960s movements, such as the movement against the Vietnam War, the social movements like the Black Power movement, the women's movement, that certain assumptions, I think, were still shared across the left. One was a certain anti-imperialism that flowed through the movements in solidarity with the Central American Revolution, mobilizations against nuclear war and the like. The left remained involved in activism around abortion rights. One of the main things I did when I first joined the ISO was clinic defenses at abortion clinics. And threats to Roe versus Wade brought out huge demonstrations in Washington in the late 1980s. And I can't help but think that we've lost both of those instincts on the left today, that we have what looks like to be a new upsurge of militarism with very little movement around it. And it appears that the Supreme Court is getting ready to overturn Roe versus Wade with very little movement against it. Now, in the early 1980s, we were entering a period that we called the employer's offensive, and of course, in the Reagan years. And some of the other speakers have referred to this already. Our small organization didn't fully draw the conclusions of what this meant until the early 1980s, when a number of debates over a number of questions, we reoriented the organization around a perspective of winning what we called ones and twos to a high level of Marxist politics. And so issues like state capitalism, permanent revolution, reform and revolution, the state, black liberation, and socialism were crucial to us. In the Reagan-Bush 1980s, conservative politics dominated and were briefly somewhat popular. Large sections of the left, who had been radicalized in the 60s and 70s, were actually giving up revolutionary politics at the time to enter into the Democratic Party through probably a large number, like through the Rainbow Coalition. If anybody's ever read the book Revolutionary Time by Max Albaum, that's a good example of somebody who was part of that kind of Maoist new communist movement who ended up into the Rainbow Coalition, the Democratic Party. Now, workers were losing more battles than they were winning. Few people would, of course, join an organization like ours that was swimming so much against the stream. And few would stick unless they had a fairly good grasp of the full range of politics to be able to see that that political position period wouldn't last forever. So given this period of decay and decline of left and socialist organizations, we felt it was important to inscribe Marxism as one of the questions for this discussion asked. At the same time, we always related to whatever struggles existed, but there weren't many of those. Also, we decided to orient around campuses. This is one of the few places where you could meet people open to more radical ideas. Workers were experiencing too many defeats. And as I said earlier, the idea wasn't that we wanted to stick around campus, but we wanted to recruit and develop people as Marxist political activists, what we'd call a cadre. That would be crucial for the future when these struggles would pick up. Now, I don't know if I explicitly answered the question about the Cold War and neoliberalism, but hopefully my account shows how both influenced our politics, the need of the Washington-Moscow politics in relationship to the Cold War, and a need to talk about Marxist politics in relationship to working class struggle that was, of course, being affected by neoliberalism or the beginnings of neoliberalism at that time. But hopefully my account shows that how both influenced our politics and how we oriented to those struggles. Now, how do we look at it from today? So from the standpoint of today, perhaps you can say that the 1980s left didn't amount to much. I mean, many of the groups that were around then aren't anymore, and remnants of the others that are in the Democratic Socialists of America and the Democratic Party now. However, what I will say is that for those of us who did become socialists in the 1980s and who remained active over the last 4 decades as socialists, it's that we learned some experience and political training that I think is valuable for people becoming active as socialists today. And I'll highlight a couple things. First, since we were a pretty small group, we had to do things for ourselves. We had to learn our politics and put them into practice as best as we could. So, whatever happened is the stuff we kind of generated to make it happen. We couldn't wait around for somebody else to do it. And second, I'd say that becoming a socialist in the Reagan era made us learn how to swim against the stream. And that's not just selling a socialist newspaper on a street corner when people would, would walk past you and yell at you to go back to Russia, but actually holding firm to principles, such as not folding into the Democratic Party when as much of the left, through campaigns such as the Rainbow Coalition or in Chicago, the Harold Washington race for mayor in 1983, was doing that at the time. And I think the political training that we got in the 1980s helped to prepare us for better times in the future, and hope that I can impart some of that to newer generations today. Thanks.
Okay, so what we're going to do now is have an opportunity for each panelist to respond to each other's presentations in 2 or 3 minutes. So we'll go in the same order with which we began. So Doug, do you have any commentary?
There's so much to process, but I'm really curious about your parents. Do you feel like movements like Fluxus were political in some sense, or were they a product of a failure of previous attempts to be political? Because I've written about Fluxus. I wrote a novel where one of the characters was a member of Fluxus, and that's how I thought of them. But yeah, so that's how I thought of Fluxus, was as a symptom of the failure of the politics of the era, as much as it wasn't just an art movement. So I'm curious to know what it was like to be raised by Fluxus artists. And I've noticed that all of us, well, the questions push us in this direction, right? But we're all talking about the 80s in terms of neoliberalism. Of course we would. And we're all talking about the 80s in terms of the Cold War. Of course we would. But I don't know, the Cold War now seems more relevant maybe than it would have been a year ago. And the question of imperialism seems different today with Russia and Ukraine than it would have a year ago. And I'm just wondering, do you feel as though the way in which the question of imperialism was framed, the question of neoliberalism and how that was framed, and the question of nuclear Armageddon, the threat of nuclear war, how all these things went together in the 80s, are still how we're thinking about these conflicts today, these problems today, or do we have an opportunity now, regardless of how old we are, damn it, to rethink and develop a new kind of politics? Is there an opportunity now that wasn't present in the 80s? Would be my question to all of us, I guess.
James?
Doug, I'm flattered you're interested. I mean, look, it wasn't just Fluxus. It was, it was weirdly, my dad was, he said to me proudly, a corresponding secretary of the Situationist International. And I said, what did that involve? And he said, I was just the only person in Leeds that subscribed to the Situationist International. So they made me the corresponding secretary. Right. And there was lots going on, and I don't like this, I understand it, but I don't like the division that the things that those people were doing, those artists were doing, were a derivative of the political moment. I think they were part of whatever that moment was. I'm not trying to argue it, but
I don't mean to attack your old man.
No. I would happily attack him, but for all kinds of things. But I think it was. And they were genuinely interested in social revolution too, but I really emphasize this point. It was a part and parcel of the whole thing, and he sold Freedom newspaper, which were founded by Prince Kropotkin back in about 1911 or whenever. But in 1963, the cover of Freedom, on the occasion of the assassination of I'm embarrassed to say this, J.F. Kennedy, was "So What?", which was a great kind of anarchist intervention in, don't follow leaders. But it was a bit of an abusive and rude thing to say to people after Kennedy had just been shot. But I think it appealed as well because it was slightly mad. I don't mean like in a bad way. I mean, I think there was a real interest in changing everything, in overturning every apple cart, as well as the one about how you order the social production, let's say, and that I think was just indicative of its time. So it was around. They listened to Cornelius Cardew's Scratch Orchestra, and were there at the terrible moment when Cardew presented them with a score. They've been playing freeform, without a score for 10 years, you know, just like this, you know, for hours, until they all were fed up. And then he presented them with this marching music, and they become a Maoist. And if you listen to it now, by the way, there's something oddly beautiful about that hymn to the working class that Cardew wrote for a group that can't have had more than 8 members, that toured Canada, I seem to recall. So what am I getting at is that, I mean, I think the times were definitely revolutionary, but I think this is the key, is that the revolution against corporate Britain, and I guess America and Canada too, didn't end up being seen through by the left. It ended up being seen through by the right, the people who dismantled the post-war consensus, who ripped apart which were, and it needed to go. I want to say that before you get people, I'm a bit bemused. I keep talking to people who say, oh, you know, the glorious Trent, the 30 years, you know, how marvelous it was. I remember it as a deeply humiliating and degrading time, you know, because they were divorced and my mother was a single parent. We got free school dinners, and we sat on the free school dinners table, you know, there was like social shaming writ large, which in a modern era you wouldn't actually do that in Britain. I don't know if they would do that in America. You wouldn't like wear the stupid hat to say you're poor, because actually, you know, in many ways the world is better. I was reading this interesting thing about there was an important struggle in East London about housing for Bangladeshis. Bangladeshi migrants had come late, and they were shut out of all housing stock, which was controlled by local authorities, by municipal authorities, who resolutely enforced a program which was called Friends and Family, which meant that only white people got onto the council housing list. And in an interview with Bangladeshi community leaders, they said, we loved Margaret Thatcher's, they hated her for all her policies on immigration, but they loved the selling off of the council houses, because it was the first chance they got to live in houses that weren't squats. So, you know, lots of things about the post-war social democratic, the kind of pink socialism we had in Britain were horrible, really oppressive and vile. And the left was, I mean, the kind of militant wildcat strikes left of the 1970s, the rank and file movement, definitely was a protest against the old order. But by the 1980s, the only people that were interested in revolutionizing that factor were on the right, and I think that was the kind of disaster.
Can I ask him a follow-up question? Or
Yeah.
is my time done?
No.
Okay, I wanted to ask you one other thing. Okay, I wanted to ask you one other thing, which is, you mentioned that you were friendly with CLR James. You knew him.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
he wouldn't know me. I knew him.
Right. And CLR James was in a sect called I forget.
Johnson Forest tendency.
Yeah, he was in a bunch of them, but he was in one with Adoni Methylopolis and Grace Lee Boggs, Facing Reality,
Sure.
right? And he was also an editor at Socialism and Barbarism,
Yeah.
right? And so, in which Guy Debord was part of that.
Cornelius Castoriadis.
Cornelius, is that what I? Yeah.
Yeah.
Cornelius Castoriadis. So right. Okay, so it goes like this. CLR James was with Cornelius Castoriadis and Adoni Methylopolis and Grace Lee Boggs and Facing Reality. Cornelius Castoriadis was on Socialism and Barbarism. The point is, like, you can place 6 degrees of separation between everybody on the radical left, it seems like, in that period. But Cornelius said the same thing as Frank Ferruti said, which is that there is no Marxism anymore. It's dead. And not only is it dead, it was like a dead letter. It was dead on arrival. He abandoned Marxism because he thought that if it wasn't a successful revolutionary political movement, it was nothing. is that was that what Frank was abandoning?
No, I mean, I think that we genuinely thought that we could
You were reading What is to be Done in 1980 conditions.
Right, so you were trying to reinvent the political Marxism.
Yeah, we thought the organizations were gone. You know, I mean, a lot of activism at that time was like, you know, split this group and try and drag these people with you. You know, the Socialist Labour League took some people from the Communist Party, and the International Socialists took some people from the Labour Party, Young Socialists. And there was a big thing of like, you know, we're going to lead this herd over here, and we're going to lead them over there. And I think it was just like, let's not bother with that, because it was like endlessly subdividing. I really agree with Lance's point about, you know, 57 degrees of Trotskyism. I don't think in the end it was such a bad thing that people argued about politics, and they did it from the redoubts of different parties. That wasn't the issue. That wasn't the real problem. The problem was, where was the political clarification taking place? It was the real disaster was that all of these groups more or less had the same politics. They only really differed usually in their assessment of the Soviet Union, which was usually a very formalistic kind of a category war about, you know, which is the applicable category, and very rarely reflected any actual movement within the Soviet bloc. But yeah, no, I mean, James, but you know, he was a man out of time. You know, he'd been with Boggs and you know, done all these things, and he had this tremendous kind of resource of understanding, which he brought with him. And the people around him later on in London in the 1980s, which was his nephew, Darcus Howe, who, again, you know, you often come across him, and fabulous activists like Stafford Scott, Lynn Kwesi Johnson, all these people, Farouk Dondi, and they nurtured him because he was their kind of wise owl who was, you know, give them the continuity. So he was obviously doing a really he was in the International Socialists for a while. But, you know, I think he was right that basically he looked around and he thought, well, these things aren't really happening. You know, he spent a lot of time in his bedsit watching soaps, I seem to recall, was the accounts, you know, because though he'd been, you know, at different times he was involved in an important but I think wrong-headed struggle in Trinidad with a kind of black power group, mostly through Darcus Howe. But you know, it was about, we all had this basic problem, is we were trying to recuperate, you know, to keep CLR alive. There was this, I mustn't go on, but there was this fabulous struggle about the CLR James Library. There was this thing in Hackney called the CLR James Library that the municipal authority, the Hackney authority, had conceded, let's call it the CLR James Library. It was still alive. And it was the dustiest, tiniest library, like something off of the French. It was like a set on the French Dispatch. It was, you know, it was not very august. And then the Hackney Council, forgetting who he was, renamed it when they turned it into an ideas laboratory. And there was this international campaign of people writing letters, you know, you can't rename the CLR James Library, it's an outrage against this great man of, you know, that you must respect. And I think he would have been embarrassed at what happened after, because now there's this massive building with his name is written like in sort of 6-foot-high letters across the building. It's like some Stalinist monument to CLR James. It's the weirdest thing, you know, and it's got no books in it. It's got loads of computers and pads and things like that. And it was, yeah, I mean, it was really a story about his accumulated wisdom was certainly impressive, but it could not be made into something because the movement didn't exist to do that. Did I answer that? I didn't. No.
No, but you know, I'm going to stop.
Adoni.
All right. I guess the one thing that I wonder about, so my political experience as I came into the 90s and the 2000s was in the New Democratic Party. And there, the reason I would go to anarchism is for some kind of political discussion, and I would go to the NDP to do organizing, to do actual pounding signs, organizing meetings, and things like that. And there was a clear gulf between them. Although I do remember the anarchists would come, the IWW would table at the NDP conference, and they would be there. And when the Alberta NDP finally came to power, out of a strange fluke, in fact, I may have become a member of the Legislative Assembly had I stuck around. The anarchists actually staffed the organization. They were the people, because they couldn't get enough people to run the province. They had to get all the anarchists. And so I just, you know, when I was thinking about Lance's comments about like being the organization, because in some ways I was arguing in that extent, is that what would have it meant to take responsibility for Marxism in the 80s? And the way that Lance described it, and also the same as you, James, is like we would try to be true to these texts. We would read them, and we would try to bring them forward. And you know, clearly that, I would love to hear Lance just think about that, and you know, in hindsight, looking at that to the extent it was successful. Because I mean, in the example of Solidarnosc that you provided, it's unclear what taking the right side amounted to. Being on the side of the workers, you know, Poland, you know, it's unclear what that position actually amounted to, and what that education was to the Generation X person who joined the ISO at that time. What did they learn from it? Like, what would have been built over time? And it does make me think, and I know I have to fight this tendency that maybe taking positions in the 80s was the problem. That maybe the whole thing of having to know which side you took on Afghanistan and which side you took on, the Polish workers, that's what was decisive in sort of creating a lack of space for what, rethinking Marxism. And I was really curious. The way that you said it is we read What Is to Be Done in the context of the 80s. And I wanted to know what reading What Is to Be Done in the context of the 80s meant. Like, how is it different from reading it in the 70s?
Good point. Lance.
Sorry, hold on a second. Got a phone call. Okay, there, I had to stop it. Okay, can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, I mean, I saw some commonalities of the comments. Nobody seemed to think that the 80s was a great time to be political, that it was a time it was a time of decay for a lot of the left, and to actually try to make sense of the world around as it was changing, and to kind of come up with some explanation to try to take Marxism as it had been sort of handed down to us, and to try to make it relevant to a time when it in many ways didn't seem to make a whole lot of sense to what you were seeing in the world. Now, when somebody said about the question of solidarity, I mean, yeah, I was probably not that sophisticated at the time, but I think that the main point I would say about that is that the Marxist movement, or Marxism, is based on the idea of mass workers' struggle, and certainly in 1981 that was an example. 1980, 1981, that was an example of that. And to me, the question of when I said what side are you on, when you had much of the rest of the left saying the Solidarnosc movement was basically invented by the CIA, that that supported the coup in the military coup against Solidarity and so on, because of their commitment to Stalinism. I just recoiled from that in the same way that let's see, what else was I meant? Oh, right. The other thing too, I want to say that about this question of the post-war settlement and so forth, it was quite clear that yes, that was being undone. There was a political science book at the time written in the mid-'80s or something. It was called, something like The Unraveling of the New Deal Order. I can't remember exactly the title, but that's the idea that at that time, the Reagan administration, although much of what the Reagan administration did was started by the Carter administration, did sort of want it to redraw the boundaries of U.S. politics. Thatcher was probably more successful at doing it than Reagan was, but they were certainly together in that sort of imposition of the neoliberal order. Now, one of the slogans that we were sort of trained on was that, or we talked about the idea of socialism from below, that we had two ideas in mind of what we were fighting against, and that was the socialism from above of Stalinism, the socialist countries in Russia, Cuba, whatever, and the socialism represented by the reformist social democratic labor parties and so on, right? So I think that the IS politics that I became part of in the 80s, it had obviously expanded in the 60s and 70s when a lot of the left was expanding. And it also had an analysis of the labor movement and the necessity to build a rank and file perspective in both the U.S. and Britain, mainly, but in other places, where the whole post-war labor relations machinery was another thing that socialists were trying to organize against, so organize with workers from below against that machinery. C.L.R. James kind of caught some of that, although I think that he pretty much drifted out of organized Marxist politics, or at least in a direction that I don't necessarily find that useful. But a lot of his insights in terms of socialism about the struggle from below, it's about working people taking power, I think are still important today to keep in mind when the main socialist organization in the United States that claims tens of thousands of members is not even really much of a representative of socialism from above, because it's basically an adjunct, a pressure group inside the Democratic Party. So there has been a great new interest in socialism, in the last few years. But I think one of the motivations for this panel is, I think, a certain grasp that Bernie period of easy growing and identification of socialism is now run into a wall. And in fact, I think a lot of at least the most conscious sort of people who think of themselves as socialists, who want to build something to challenge the system, who are in DSA, are actually at a point where they're trying to figure out, does Marxism hold enough? What is this the organization that we need to build? Do we need to build something different? And I think that for those of us who have been around for a while, the unfortunate thing for us was that we were, people who became socialists in the last 40 years became socialists in probably one of the most barren times politically in terms of the labor movement and the working class movement, at least in the, Europe and the US, Canada, the kind of main industrial countries. And so that the thing that is sort of the lifeblood of any socialist about the idea of workers' struggle from below, the possibility of change, it was hard to see that happening in the last 30 and 40 years. So it's no accident that back in the 60s, 70s, when there was a huge upsurge, that you have all sorts of socialist groups springing out of the woodwork, a lot of them with pretty bad politics from my point of view, but that the last 40 years have been a real tough slog. And so why I say that there's an importance to actually claiming the ideas of Marxism, renovating them for the present, but connecting them to an organization as well that will fight for those principles that people like C.L.R. James stood for.
Okay, I would like to actually pose a question to the panel, myself as the moderator, before we open it up to the audience Q&A. So I was not involved in organizing this panel or even selecting the topic, but what I imagine, if I were to sort of surmise what was going on in the background, that it might be the case that we're finding ourselves going back to a 1980s type moment in the aftermath of Trump, and also paradoxically the kind of chimera or phantasm of a kind of progressive moment with the DSA and also with the Bernie Sanders campaign, and even in the Biden administration. I think that there were some claims made early on that in the first 100 days Biden was implementing some of the most progressive programs or policies ever. Kind of an absurd claim. Lance mentioned the Rainbow Coalition, Jesse Jackson's two presidential campaigns in 1984 and 1988. He also mentioned here in Chicago the Harold Washington campaign and Harold Washington's election as mayor of Chicago. So interestingly enough, we tend to forget this now. The 80s, the early 80s at least, the first Reagan term, but also into the second Reagan term, it was not seen as a kind of unalloyed move to the right or conservatism. And this would also be true about Britain under Thatcher, but was seen as a polarizing time and therefore an opportunity for an advance of the left. So I wanted to sort of recall that moment, the sort of thinking and feeling in the moment of the 80s, whereas now we might sort of retrospectively sort of render the verdict of history, oh, the 80s were, a move to the right, were conservative. In the moment, however, it had the appearance of polarization, very much like our time now. And so, just to pick up some themes that were brought up, how the left participated in a conservatism of the moment in the 80s, but under the guise of militancy and under the guise of ostensible social and political polarization that actually turned out not very much to be the case. I'll sort of add my own little bit since I'm of this Generation X. So the earliest activist experience that I had was around some kind of marquee issues of the time: Central American solidarity, South Africa solidarity, anti-apartheid. And what I was told by the militants in the New York City area where I met them, who were emigres from South Africa, from Southern Africa more generally, and also from Central America, was that socialism is off the table because the American working class voted for Reagan. And so it was a very kind of mixed set of messages that I experienced at the time, that it was crisis, social and political polarization, an opportunity for progressivism, if not for leftism per se, or socialism or Marxism, at least a kind of a progressive moment. Again, the Rainbow Coalition exemplifies that, but also Tony Benn, Labour Party, exemplifies that, and also I think from the Canadian experience, the rise of the NDP in that period. So, the neoliberal moment was contested, at least to some extent, in mainstream capitalist politics, and that had an effect on the left, which followed in the wake of that kind of phenomenon. And again, thinking about the present as a similar moment, because I think that that's what motivated this panel topic. The deeper background that was mentioned, I'll just also flag, namely the kind of pre-60s and the cultural radicalism of the 60s. So, beatniks, hippies becoming yuppies, becoming fascists, whatever, right? That sort of subcurrent was also repeated in the 80s. The 80s is also the time of postmodernism and a certain kind of end of ideology, right? That preceded the 60s, but sort of shadowed the 60s and then came into its own in the 80s. And that we might be moving into another period like that now. Like we might have a kind of disenchantment, a kind of end of ideology moment. One thing that I prepared for this panel to come in and mention, and since it was brought up in terms of the counterculture or kind of avant-garde art, was alongside postmodernism, there's the so-called cultural turn on the left. So the turn to Gramsci, Stuart Hall, cultural studies, all this stuff. And again, it had a kind of mixed character. It was resistance to Thatcher, resistance to Reagan, but it also had a veneer of radicalism, right? That we're gonna expand the kind of radical revolutionary agenda to include things beyond economics and traditionally understood politics into the realm of culture. And of course, that fed into things like identity politics. And why in a bad way someone like C.L.R. James, who's like a serious political person, might have been sentimentally venerated in that late moment in a way that does a disservice to the actual political history that he represented. So anyway, that's what I wanted to sort of throw out to the panelists for one more round before we turn to the audience. Doug.
Oh gosh, great, thanks. Okay. There's a lot to mull over there. I guess I just am listening to everybody, and I have question after question going through my mind, because what I want to do is ask the question that clarifies what the panel is, and why it's important right now. I mean, you just said that you thought we might be going back into a 1980s moment. It's a very odd one. I mean, if this is the third time through for the Cold War, then what does it mean? Then I mean, part of me worries, yeah, third time's a charm. We get the nukes this time.
50s, 80s, 20s.
Yeah. But I feel as though we're not really returning to the 80s. That we really are. There's going to be a change. There's something that's changing. I mean, I think you actually put your finger on it years ago about that we're entering into a post-neoliberal era, and that we can see it now as it kind of manifests politically, as opposed to it originally in 2008, it was an economic crisis that broke the neoliberal consensus, and you had Alan Greenspan saying, "Oh, I guess my ideology was wrong," and then the election of Trump seemed to break it politically, but now it's being broken geopolitically. And so I think it's a very dangerous moment, and which maybe it's not so bad for people on the left but people at this conference to say, okay, we don't have a position. That's, I think, a good point. We don't have a position right now because we need to be able to think and respond in some way that's not just automatic, not just a repeat of the 80s. But I also see there's things about the 80s that aren't true now just because of that change, because of it's a post-neoliberal moment. I don't know if Biden is ratifying this populist neo-nationalist term from Trump or not, or I have confusion as to whether neoliberalism now means the U.S. dollar. Is that neoliberalism, the power of finance around the world, or is the new nationalism actually going to end up being the rise of China and Russia as equal powers in the world? So I'm listening to us reminisce, and it all seems like it's just a story of something that's out of control. So I'm gonna stop there, and that's my optimistic take.
Cool, James.
It's certainly compelling that in the British example that it does feel exactly like a repeat, like Ghostbusters 2 kind of. The Benn campaign, which never conquered the Labour Party but was important in drawing left-wing activists back into the Labour Party that they'd fallen out of love with in the 60s and 70s. And my blunt judgment would be wasted a lot of people's energy and willpower in a probably necessarily losing project, but I appreciate that's a bit abrupt. But
Like
by this,
Corbyn, like with Corbyn.
Yeah.
this is the thing. I think that which has been, I mean, it's unnerving, and I feel very bad about it because I'm old, and I didn't want to be that person saying it's all going to end in tears, comrades. But and then carried on saying that over and over again, which would be terrible if it was a prejudgment. But I think it wasn't wrong in the sense that what happened over. I appreciate I'm coming at it from my own point of view. The Brexit decision was that the Corbyn team. That had conquered, I don't know if you know this story, but the Labour Party became more left-wing, on paper anyway, than it had ever been in its existence, with the bizarre ascendance of Jeremy Corbyn to its leadership, really because all other options were closed off. You know, the Blairite centrism of the 90s had really worn itself out and was degraded and repulsive to people. The Labour right as it used to exist just simply doesn't exist. They said, oh, go on, let's let Jeremy stand in the leadership, in the membership election. This is complicated, but the MPs nominate and the party votes. And they nominated him thinking that he wouldn't win. Right. And he won a landslide of the members, and it was like the bottled up frustration of Labour Party members over sort of 20 years of being told that, if we just try and make ourselves more attractive to the mainstream, then we can sneak in and we'll be able to do one or two good things. And that being so sort of debilitating and demoralising that then they said, no, let's just have us, let's have somebody like us. And Jeremy is exactly like the rank and file Labour Party. People I went to college with were so elated that, finally it was their time. And I was biting my tongue all the time. I wrote it occasionally because I thought I know exactly what, I didn't know. That would be, I'm not the soothsayer. But I could see that this thing was going to expose what had never really been exposed, the limitations of left reformist politics. And it really did in this brutal way, because at the key point when the question was put, should we have a government elected by people in Britain, or shall we have our legislators chosen by the European Union, the Labour Party dodged this question and sided on, in my view, completely the wrong opinion. And it made them into a laughingstock. And I can remember campaigning politically over this issue. And Jeremy Corbyn, whose sole status and reputation was that he was an honest man, was left defending this absurdly complicated position where they were going to have a second referendum to correct the first referendum, and they were going to argue that we should leave, in the referendum they were going to argue that we should leave, we should join the European Union, but they would negotiate on the basis that, anyway, we couldn't make any sense of it. And I remember everybody you talk to would say, they're just as bad. They're just as bad as every cheese-paring politician. We voted for something and they spat in our faces. And it broke them. It completely broke them. They'd lost which Tony Benn would have understood better, was that you cannot be against the people. You cannot appeal. You can't ask to be elected to be a government and say, and I don't respect your vote. It's not rocket science. You can't say, I want to be elected so that I can rip up your vote. It completely came down to that sociologically, the people in the Labour Party were really not Democrats. They didn't believe in popular sovereign control. They believed in people like them in positions of authority in the local state and eventually in the national state.
And that goes the Corbyn side. That would be Corbyn as well that thinks that way.
Well, Corbyn is the most amazing character of all because he was a Brexiteer from the point that he was elected in 1983 right up until the eve of the referendum, And then because his younger Momentum supporters were against it, he loved them more than he loved himself. And then you thought, well, how could you, you're a man of principle, but how could you abandon your principle at the one point when you're actually asked, shall I defend my principle? And then immediately after, he was a Brexiteer again. Yep. Nobody could take it seriously. Yep. Sorry, I went into one then, but that's my thing.
Mm-hmm. Adoni.
On the early 80s and the depolarization, the polarization in the early 80s were a shock. My family, most families in North America went through the recession. It was brutal. Yeah. It was a brutal recession, and it changed the landscape of Canadian politics as it did here. You had, strange characters like Ross Perot emerge in the 90s, but still, there's this brewing. In Canada, we suddenly had new parties. The Conservative Party imploded and became a new party, and then split and became a new party, and Quebec separatism reemerged. Mm-hmm. The other thing I would say, though, what came out of that early NDP was something new. The NDP collapsed as a party and then turned into an NGO. So Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, led by Mel Watkins, who in the 60s was staged an attempted coup of the NDP, led up the NGO, and really what came out of it at the end of the day wasn't a party, but Naomi Klein. Mm. That's what we got in Canada, and the shocking thing was Naomi Klein is married to Avi Lewis, and I remember at the 2016 federal convention, they brought to the floor a Green New Deal platform, Avi and Naomi, and they kept putting the mic in their face, will you run for leadership? And they said, Avi Lewis, straight-faced, said, I don't live in that world. Avi Lewis's father was the head of the Ontario Party. His grandfather was the head of the federal party. His great-grandfather was an activist in the Bund. And he didn't have any, it wasn't his world. It was very bizarre. So my sense is what comes out of this is a very if there are political organizations as a kind of fracturing into something, and that made me think of Lance's comments. So Lance was talking about the draw in the 80s of losing members to the Democrats, and this kind of attempt to try and keep the ISO together when there's this constant draw against the attempt to restabilize the system with some kind of new political formation that freaks everybody out. The final thing I was going to say is the other thing that I noticed in the 80s that happened was Canada got its Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and then the left became preoccupied with court cases. Mm. It would litigate everything. And so, I was thinking of Roe versus Wade. It was like that Lance brought up. That's the way the left did things. They didn't do things politically anymore. And that's, a potential for where this goes. A kind of the old organizations live on in some different form, the old left organization. The DSA continues, but it doesn't look the same.
Thanks. Lance?
One thing I'll say about the question of polarization in the 1980s, I think that the overall trend, was to the right, to the defeat of the left and so on, but it wasn't without fights, right? I don't know if people remember there was a meatpacker strike, the P9 strike in the middle of the 80s that had some really good militant activity, but there was just up against too much, including its own union, that ended up in a defeat. I remember the first time I went to Britain, I went to the Marxism conference, and the Socialist Workers' Party sponsored, young socialists. It was really cool to be there and all that. And it was there in 1984 in the middle of the miners' strike. And we were getting ready to go, get up at 6 in the morning or whatever it was to go to a picket line. And I remember waking up to the alarm clock and the alarm clock reporting that the secondary picket had been called off, something like that. I forget the exact, I'd have to go back and look at the exact historical reference, but it was something that if it had actually succeeded, could have really shifted things in the favor of the miners. But it turned out that the miners, I think, backed down. And I think the miners' strike was definitely a real marker in the 1980s in Britain as kind of, I don't know if it was a final defeat, but certainly a huge defeat for a section of workers that had been responsible for helping to bring down, Tory governments in the past, not that far back distant future of that period. And so obviously something was going on. I mean, I remember going to a lot of picket lines in the 1980s where you'd kind of walk away going, man, this is really terrible. I mean, it's like people are losing their livelihoods, their lives on the line here. The employers are putting them out on the street. There's very little hope here. So that's the overall, position of the 1980s. But not that there were not fights nor some victories here and there. But another thing too is that it's also around the time that the civil rights movement comes into a position where I think in a lot of ways it sort of it's won a certain level of legal status and legal victories in the past, 15 years or whatever before that. But at that time then, the Democratic Party offers the opening to a layer of politicians to come in and to take their position as sort of the junior partners in the urban centers around the country. And so that's another aspect that actually later on makes things like the crime bill in the 1990s something that actually had a lot of black politician support initially. They would run away from that fact now, but there was a lot of support at that time for that bill that ended up, producing the mass incarceration state over the last 30 years. So, I think we also have to remember that those struggles, there were some, the Rainbow Coalition, although we were never involved with it and, wrote articles about why you shouldn't be in the Democratic Party and all that. The fact that Jesse Jackson would go to places like Maine, where there were strikes of paper workers to talk to these all-white audiences, was actually, for a number of people, it probably didn't last because the strike itself was defeated, but for a lot of people at that time, it actually meant something that you'd have this sort of melding of the civil rights tradition and some of the labor movement. But again, the whole trajectory was downward. Let's see. And the Harold Washington campaign, I saw on the Platypus website, you had Abdul Al-Kilimat not long ago giving a presentation about, I think, the Washington campaign. May have been pre-pandemic, I'm not sure. But that was a huge thing in Chicago. And to be in an organization that was saying the Democratic Party is not the way forward, it was kind of hard to be in a situation where there was such a racist backlash against Washington at the time. I knew plenty of people that I worked with all the time on all sorts of activist events and issues that were heavily involved in the campaign, and some of them who ended up becoming Democratic Party officials. The Black Panther Party, such as Bobby Rush, ended up in the Democratic Party. So that's kind of what I think about the 1980s. And as far as like today, there's just a question of neoliberalism and neo-nationalism. It does seem like that the neoliberal agenda kind of crashed after the 2008-2009 recession. It was sort of revivified by Obama, but we see around the world the rise of these sort of nationalist politicians and nationalist movements and whatnot that at least pretend to be against neoliberalism, although a lot of them are actually basically putting forth neoliberal or pro-employer, anti-working class positions. And so I'm not exactly sure what I would say is coming to the future, but it seems to me that yes, we're out of the period of the kind of triumphant U.S. coming out of the end of the Cold War. we're into some uncharted territory. I think that the war around Ukraine has raised a lot of issues of the possibility of further militarization, further buildup of weapons across the European Union and the United States. And so we're going to have to revisit some of those questions, such as nuclear war and opposition against militarism, that were maybe more front and center back in the 1980s, probably in the future.
Thanks. So let's turn to some audience questions. We have a few hands went up. So we have microphones. So what I'd like to do is, are we circulating the microphone, or are we having people walk up to the microphone? Okay, so those of you who, I saw a couple of people, like 3 people over there, if you could come up to the microphone.
I'm sure Conrad gets to do. He was here for the other panel, didn't get to ask a question.
Okay, Conrad, go for it. And yeah, and then you'll be, let's see, look at Conrad, Danny, and then Tom. Yeah, so Conrad, Danny, and Tom. I'm not going to know everybody's name, but go ahead.
Hi, Chris.
Hi.
So, James, I just wanted to narrow in a little bit on your comments regarding Brexit, which puzzled me a little bit. So when you talked a little bit about Corbyn, and maybe this is relevant to the 80s theme insofar as Corbyn is a relic from the 80s, right?
Yes.
But when you talked about Corbyn, you said he sort of spat in the face of British people and the will of the public and this kind of thing. And I would be a bit concerned that when you talk about it this way, that there's a certain reification of the idea of the people that goes on that perhaps ignores the fissured character of, sort of the political and cultural landscape of Britain. I mean, it seems to me that with something like, Brexit, which was it 51% of people who voted for it, right? And I think there's already a reification at the level of the plebiscite form, which happens for us to take that as synonymous with all people, right? But with something like Brexit, it seems to me that it was catastrophic for the Labour Party precisely because of the way that it divided, the constituencies which supported it, right? So you had a lot of people who were sort of part of the professional class living in urban cities, right? And then you had obviously, members of the working class or reserve army of labor, as the case may be in the north and other areas who were very opposed to it. And I just feel like in any event, that would have been a very, very difficult thing to negotiate, and I think quite catastrophic for the Labour Party. Now, maybe you can argue that it would have been better if they'd stuck to their position in the initial election, right? At least for the purposes of coherency, right? But then if we talk about the threat posed by the Liberal Democratic Party, I mean, people were sitting around months before Corbyn's final election wondering if they were going to be in a situation where the Liberal Democrats were going to take Brixton, or some sort of tremendous upset like that. So I guess I just I kind of wonder. I mean, don't you see that as a decidedly more complex issue in that respect than maybe you presented it in that way? I mean, I just don't think that there was any solution, really. And maybe you can argue that it would have been better, just to support Brexit with the goal of shedding a lot of the members and creating a different kind of party. But I do feel like the complexity of that has to be acknowledged.
James.
I don't know if I'm going to do justice. Obviously, it is a lot more complicated. I'd already decided I was for Brexit before there had been a referendum because I did my doctorate on it and I'd reflected on the question and it seemed, before I thought about what its impact on different people would be, it just seemed to me clear. Sorry, where are you? I'm trying to look at you.
He went back to the seat.
What have I done there? Would that ever stop?
Go ahead.
I mean, I was going to vote Brexit anyway because it seemed to me like a no-brainer political question. Should the legislative be, the lawmakers be elected by the people that experience the laws they elected, or should they be made in part by people that weren't elected? And I often get in this conversation with Americans a bit surprised by it, and I always say to them, well, there is a space, you know, if you want to join the European Union, I'm sure that they would love to have America in it. But apart from the silly answer, I think the democratic answer was right. Reification of the people, I mean, I kind of get what you're saying, but I think before there was a Marxism, there was a democracy, and if you read Marx's works, he calls it the democracy. Whereas he never was a Marxist. I think democracy is at the core of any prospective movement for social change, because there is no higher value than the people. There is no higher value than the people. Would it have been necessarily difficult for the Labour Party? Absolutely, yes, it would. I didn't think that there was an easy answer. But I did think it was at least the beginning of an answer, that the person leading the party had been voting to leave the European Union since 1983, and that at least there was a chance that they could have built a democratic campaign. The people it offended in the Labour Party, I think, were the people that were the problem. You know, they were the people that were and are now the ones who are running the Labour Party at the moment, the ones who represent the limitation of that party. And I think it was a shame, actually, that the old left caved in to the younger left on that question, because I mean, you know, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. This was the decision that they fumbled, and the one that handed the government over to Boris Johnson. The party that stood for, we will do what the people asked us to do, lo and behold, was elected by those same people. Whereas the Liberal Democratic Party, who, as you rightly intuit, were in no danger ever of taking Brixton, got a derisory vote in the 2019 election, as did every party that supported any kind of ambiguity on that was remotely ambiguous or doubtful or against Brexit. The exception, of course, being Scotland, which is because it's a very different question. But overwhelmingly, I mean, maybe if there had been no referendum, this wouldn't be quite so obvious. But it's like this: if you'd gone to a football match and your team had won, and then the referee said, "Now we'll go into extra time, and you know, we'll let the other team try and catch up," any person with a shred of common sense would say, "That's crooking it. That's cheating. That's you're making monkeys out of us. You're treating us like idiots." And that was at the core, I think, of what was wrong with the Labour Party, is that it treated its voters like a stage army. It had no respect for their decision-making power. It treated them as voting fodder, but not as people that they would listen to. So I know I know this isn't going to satisfy you, but I'm very happy for you to come back. But I think that's.
Well, I'm going to have to be satisfied to do a lot of questions.
Danny.
I have a quick question. What do you see as the legacy of the 1980s to the millennial left? So in the first issue of Jacobin, Bhaskar Sankara had an article called "Why We Love the Zapatistas." And the idea was that we had loved them, but now there was an opportunity for something that we could go beyond certain problems in the 80s. And likewise, I think Chris mentioned this earlier, postmodernism. So there's also a millennial reaction against postmodernism. There's like neo-Hegelianism, neo-Kantianism. But from a kind of 80s perspective, does it really appear that the millennial left had actually overcome perhaps certain problems that were there in the 80s, or did they actually even misrecognize them? So how do you see the legacy of the 1980s affecting the millennial left?
Is that to everybody, or?
Yeah.
And Lance as well.
Yeah.
Lance, if you'd like to say something about that.
Just let me know.
Boy.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah, I was kind of trying to get my thoughts together on that. I didn't exactly hear what the speaker said about Bhaskar Sankara and Jacobin, but I don't know. I guess to me, I would say that there's a whole layer of people who, and we'll just say, joined the DSA. You know, that's probably the main sort of representative of socialism today, who joined out of the Bernie Sanders campaign. They're facing a kind, you know, right now the group is facing a kind of impasse, and from what I understand, is losing members and so on. But I guess the thing that's I think about the 1980s. I mean, the DSA was founded in the early 1980s, 1982, I think it was, and it was a merger of the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee and the New American Movement, which were both one sort of, in some ways, the DSOC was sort of moving, quote, to the left to embrace the social movements. This is big shorthand, okay? And the NAM was moving to the right as it was dropping a lot of its revolutionary, kind of more Marxist, Gramscian type politics and moving toward an embrace to the kind of reformism in the Democratic Party. And to me, it would seem to me that that one of the lessons from that time that should be learned by the millennial left is to go back and look at some of that history and that period. And though, you know, history doesn't always repeat itself and it's not the same and all the rest of it, but there are certain things that you can point to and say, well, what actually became of that? Or what about the people that were radical, that thought that the Rainbow Coalition was a huge thing, was going to transform American politics? And in some ways, other than sort of the rhetoric of Sanders, there was a lot more social movement sort of radicalism around the Rainbow Coalition in 1984 and later than there was around the Bernie Sanders campaign. So people could look back at that period and actually, you know, evaluate it, although I think that there's a, you know, lack of historical memory, which is not necessarily anybody's fault today. You know, large number of people moved in one direction because of their experience, and the first thing that the first thing they do isn't to kind of go back and, you know, think about history and everything like that. But it's up to people like ourselves who have been around the past to actually talk about some of these lessons and to talk about what, you know, why they're important, and to figure out today what it means for somebody to be a socialist in a situation where, you know, much of the socialist movement is intertwined with the Democratic Party in some way or another. And to me, that's not really a recipe for success.
Thanks. Doug?
I would say something about postmodernism. I'm thinking about that question. The bit about Zapatistas, I'd have to think about even more. But I think that it's possible to return to the same difficulties that brought postmodernism to the front of a certain kind of leftist thought, and not resolve the difficulties, but just move to the other side. So you can end up like an analytic philosopher instead of a postmodernist continental type. You know, you can embrace the new atheists, or you can be hard-headed empiricists instead. And the return to Hegel, I guess, for, you know, Judith Butler. You told me Judith Butler is reading Hegel, so
Well,
I'm not sure.
she did a dissertation on Hegel,
Right.
and then she comes full circle, I think. Yeah.
So you can postmodernize anything. So, so I'm, you know, I think that it will take more than. I think we're going to have to solve it in action, solve it politically. We can't just solve it through literary movements or media, unfortunately. I mean, that's not what I want to say, but I think it's the truth.
James, you know, you wrote a book that Death of the Subject explained. Do you have anything to add on the postmodern question and how that figures politically?
I've got troubled by this microphone, aren't I? I mean, it was the reason I did it. I was the book reviews editor of Living Marxism magazine, and all these books kept coming in, and I knew that the way to do a good book review was whenever there was a load of books on the same subject, that would make a good book review. And weirdly, all these publishers looking for where the hell they could get these books on postmodernism reviewed sent them to Live in Marxism magazine. And all my colleagues, my comrades, looked at, oh God, I can't do this. I said, well, you know, I did a bit of this at college. I'll have a look. And then that was kind of how I got doing it. But what I mean, again, it's a crude summation. I thought it was really intriguing that that it was a French experience, because in France there was this very strong left, reformist left that had actually been the government. That their alternative wasn't neoliberalism; it was statist, but it had broken in this dramatic way. And that how much of the postmodern reflection really kind of, I mean, this is crude, but it distilled, you know, I don't want to go out on the paper sale. You know, that was what I heard in John Baudrillard's book. You know, please don't send me out on another paper sale. I don't want to go to the meeting and make the intervention. And it was like it had this epiphany where he says, not only is Marxism dead, all ideology is dead, you know, and it was like everything is gone, you know, and not I made a mistake or we went the wrong way or something like that. It was like ideas themselves are the problem here, and it was
it's like a Fluxus artist.
Very much, and but Fluxus was good. And then you saw this magic moment where I mean, people. My brother lives in France, and he made the point to me that in France itself, very few people read the postmodernists. Right. The postmodernists wrote; they were French, and they wrote from their French experience. But American universities lapped it up. I mean, British universities to an extent, but American universities. Yep. And I thought, well, this is just perfect, isn't it? Because the deconstruction of Marxism experienced by unhappy ex-Marxists who are fed up with being drilled into yet another kind of activity, pointless activity, really spoke to Americans who were just at that moment falling out of love with a particular ideology of Reaganism, of patriotism, of the family, and the deconstruction was, I thought, it like little weevils coming, like eating away at the, you know, it was like the perfect critique, because it never kind of came clobbering you with no, it's not that, it's this. It was more like, just let me deconstruct you a bit more, and it would just kind of come nibbling away. And it really, I mean, obviously this is bad to dismiss all the hard intellectual work that was going on to get to this point, but it really felt like that this was symptomatic of a collapse of some ideologies, and that weirdly the experience of the collapse of Marxism in France could somehow be a template for people to understand the exhaustion, collapse, however you want to say it, the end of a particular sort of 1980s Ronald Reagan-ish era of American exceptionalism, patriotism, something.
Adoni, did you have?
Just a real quick remark. The despair that, you know, when I was in the 90s, we read Carolyn Merchant, Death of Nature. It was, the thing that I wonder about is whether that despair ever left. Like, when I looked at the DSA, you know, I would see most of those themes that I read in the 90s still there and quite prominent. So I do wonder to the extent that it, you know, it was incorporated, and maybe that's, you know, I don't know what to make of that, but I mean, I wonder to the extent that it was actually postmodernism just left, and we were left, you know, the Zapatistas were gone, and then we started something new, that the Zapatistas were always there. They were running the NDP convention, after all. Mm-hmm. Okay, mm-hmm. That's it.
Mark.
Yeah.
Addressing the Stalinist misleadership in the Third Period and Popular Front, Trotsky once famously stated in The Death Agony of Capitalism, "The historical crisis of mankind is reduced to the crisis of revolutionary leadership." In the 1970s, New Left underwent its Leninist turn as a belated recognition of the necessity of political organization after the spontaneity of 1968. My question is this: what is the historical legacy of the strategy of splits and regroupments in the context of the 1980s onwards as an attempt to reconstitute a proletarian vanguard as a revolutionary leadership and as a preservation of the orthodoxy of Marxism in the context of anti-Reaganism and anti-Thatcherism?
I don't want to start that. Why don't you start that?
I forgot to say, this is primarily directed towards Selfa and secondarily to Heartfield.
Okay, Lance.
Yeah. Well, what I would say is that there were many attempts, or some successful, some not, at regroupment in the 1980s among groups on the left. As I just mentioned a little bit ago, in some ways you could call the DSA the product of a regroupment of two forces or two organizations on the left at that time. Solidarity was another one of smaller Trotskyist groups, and I know there have been a number of different attempts by some of the different Maoist or new communist groups to do the same. But they, none of them, including the ones I were involved with, were able to constitute any kind of vanguard, because I think that the vanguard itself, and our understanding of it, was always that the vanguard is in the working class. And that you don't create it from just being on the outside of the right politics. You try to actually have the right politics, or the politics that speaks to the aspirations of people that can organize and take the struggle for socialism forward, because they have the power to do it in the workplace. But the fact that anybody can sort of go out and proclaim they have the right ideas doesn't make it so, nor does it mean that anybody's going to listen to you. So we had some success in organizing and training a layer of people that became active in different unions and so forth. But if you look at the overall trajectory of the labor movement and that creation of that vanguard, which is, in my head, it's sort of a self-conscious political cadre of people, some in left organizations, maybe some that are not, but work with left organizations, but are implanted in the working class. I just don't think we have that, and haven't had that for years, for decades. And you can't create you can't have the kind of leadership that is necessary to actually fight for socialism if you don't have the merger of something of socialist politics and that more organic link to that class. You don't, and you also don't invent it by having people who are socialists go get jobs in industry. I'm not against that. I think people want to do that. It's fine. It's great, but don't confuse that with the actual sort of rhythm of capitalism, the class struggle that creates a layer of workers that would look to embrace a socialist politics to take it forward. So that's the way I would react to that question.
For James, I want to bring this back. You said that in the 80s you were reading What Is to Be Done specifically, perhaps with this question in mind. How were you reading it?
Well, thank you for bringing that back, and I will come to this. We read What Is to Be Done because we thought, I mean, we probably might have been deluded, but we thought that it was telling us something, it was helping us to understand something that was taking place in the 1980s in the left, which was a worship of spontaneity. And that was the key thing, that it was about we really thought that the role of a political party or proto-political party in making an intervention was not to kind of cheer on the things that working people were already doing themselves, hurrah for your strike, but to intervene in that and to, in some senses, even disrupt it, polarize, push a political project within the context of that. Now, I want to say that going to the question, I think it's important that, we wound that organization up. We had a conversation about a big series of conferences where we discussed the fact that what we had hoped to achieve, which was to say to build a new revolutionary tradition, a new revolutionary tradition, that we had failed. That the moment that might have been a possibility, which is the disappointment of the reformist project in the 1980s, I think Lance is right to point to the importance of the defeat of the miners' strike, that the prospect of that had evaporated, and that I think I want to emphasize this, that there was no point in nurturing an organization whose practical purpose had ceased to exist, that we'd never thought of our political project as being outside of actual history, as being a thing that you could carry on outside of the fact that there was this real contest for leadership taking place. And I remember the way that we said it back to ourselves was that by the 1980s, it was clear there was no contest for leadership. Nobody wanted the leadership of the working class. The working class didn't want the leadership of the working class. The Labour Party didn't want the leadership. They wanted to make a deal with the Liberal Democrats. The revolutionary left had given up on the prospect of winning a majority. It was dedicated instead through organisations like Charter 88 to pluralising opposition to making a space for the left. So our conclusion was that it was a dead end. The moment had gone, and that it wouldn't come again until other things had moved on. And the last thing I want to say on this is that I'm not convinced, and this goes to this, that when society in its dissatisfied component changes and begins to remake history, which I see some signs of, by the way. I think this is a good time, by the way. I don't know that they'll even call themselves socialists. I don't know whether they'll want to read what is to be done necessarily. I think they'll be thinking about critically trying to understand their situation today, which might be very, very different from what is to be done or capital or any of those things, because any real movement for transformation won't be people dumping some books from the past. This is where I'm so sympathetic to your scoffing. There won't be a pre-written blueprint or program. It can only really arise out of what the actual struggles were. This is where, by the way, I love the idea that solidarity, whatever you thought about what happened afterwards, was a fabulous movement. It was completely un-Marxist. It was anti-socialist, really, but it was without doubt a workers' movement against the oppression or barriers that those people felt, which was the Jaruzelski government, and all power to them. They changed the course of history, and they fit no template that we wish. They're not fulfilling any kind of ideal of the socialist movement, but they made history. And I think we forget that the point is not to, tick the right boxes. It's to move on. It's to change the world in a better way.
When you in the RCP disbanded or gave up the ghost, was that before the collapse of the Berlin Wall and before the collapse of the Soviet Union, or was it was after? So that must have had that informed that decision as well, right?
Oh yeah, no, we thought initially we were hopeful that the collapse of Stalinism would make would also create a possibility. But what we experienced, which I think Istvan Matzaros described very well, he said it didn't matter if the left-wing parties were not associated with the Communist Party, as much as they would try and say we're not communists, we're not Stalinists. When the big boat went down, it dragged all the other boats with it, because you couldn't speak intelligibly. I really think this in terms of East Europe, where the experience is so different. You cannot say to people, no, socialism is good, to people whose lived experience of socialism is that was what their oppression was.
Right.
You know?
I just want to say, though, when you say we won't need to read Capital to form the new society, I think, Hartfield's in Gulag after the revolution. but otherwise,
I'm not saying don't read Capital, but I'm just saying it won't. Yeah.
I mean, interestingly enough, because we're still living in the aftermath of the Trump experience, Steve Bannon would cite Lenin, right?
Yeah.
So somebody's going to be reaching back for this history. They're going to be like, oh, who said that power is in the streets? Right? Oh, that Lenin, right? Tom.
Sort of young democratic socialists in the 80s, of which I was one in both DSOC and then DSA, we were very conscious of grappling with the idea that capitalism was changing, transforming from a Fordist stage to a post-Fordist stage, and how that would have dramatic effects upon leftist politics. So I think the Rainbow Coalition was one response, was one attempt to respond to that. Lance mentioned the P9 strike against Hormel, which was very informative. And what is interesting about that strike, there was a trade union battle against Fordist patterns of union bargaining. That the P9 plant, they wanted to break out of a sort of collective bargaining relationship with other less efficient plants, and so it was actually a rebellion against Fordist era trade unionism within the trade union movement, and I wonder whether sort of the connection between now and the 80s is something of the fact that we first really became aware of how that post-Fordism was going to transform leftist politics, and now post-Fordism has really happened, and we're actually still not able to really deal with what a leftist politics would be like in that context. Thank you.
Lance, did you have anything on that one?
One thing I will say, I think it's true that the P9 strike was wanting to oppose that pattern agreement. What it was opposing was the fact that the union wanted all the other plants to accept lower wages. The P9 strike wanted higher wages and said all the other locals should be with us, not the other way around. So then it was actually, it was smashed by both the National Guard and its own union that actually organized a decertification campaign inside of it. So okay, that's just a small thing, or not a small thing, but it was an example of the kind of struggle that happened in the 1980s that was defeated, and what the outcome of that defeat was, the deunionization of a lot of that industry, and a real decline in living standards across the Midwest and Midwest industrial towns. So we're living with those legacies today still, and places like Amazon are able to move into places like, well, I don't know if they have a plant in where Hormel was, but places like that, and set up shop in a situation where there is very little union organization or even sort of consciousness that that's something to strive for. However, there are now organizing campaigns around Starbucks, around Amazon, and so on. So we have to see where that goes. I don't think the union movement itself is actually really ready to take that on. But the only way it actually happens is if people from below fight back. So let's see. I think the only other thing about that is that we've seen the 1980s. In the 1980s, what was happening in terms of the shift toward neoliberalism, the shift toward more free market economics, social conservatism, and all that, that was the beginning of that. We've had 40 years of that, with ups and downs along the way. And so it shouldn't be any big surprise that what is in store for people if they don't fight back and try to do something about it, because it just means that things get worse for more and more people. A small number of people may get, may actually have higher living standards or make more money off of it, more billionaires than ever, but majority of people are just getting by or worse. One thing I will say, let's see, about the whole postmodernist thing, I can't say I'm either a great expert or a big fan of any of that stuff, but I think that it definitely is a set of ideologies that attempts to deconstruct, is to use the earlier word, Marxism, or the idea that there's that class is something that brings people together, that there's a kind of logic to the system that you can locate and fight against. It celebrates fragmentation, and for social movements and for the labor movement, you have to always combat that. You have to actually try to overcome that fragmentation. And I think that some of the millennial left has grasped that, and that's the Jacobins, and so on. But they've actually, I think, drawn the wrong conclusions. They've said, against identity politics, against postmodernism, we want to bring back essentially right-wing social democracy. And I just don't think that's really much of a starter either. We have to figure out a way, as Marxists, to reclaim a Marxism that fights for the working class, that sees the working class as being composed of a number of different races and ethnicities, genders, gender identities, and so on, and that we have to as Lenin talked about it, be the champions, the tribunes of the oppressed in the fight for socialism.
So I want to reconnect the question that Tom posed with something that came up earlier, which is that the 80s were kind of defensive, that it was about holding on to something that seemed to be passing. And so rather than thinking about it, just in terms of a change in capitalism from Fordist capitalism to post-Fordist or neoliberal capitalism, that also what was passing was a form of leftism, a form of labor organizing, or organized labor. I'm reminded of my old mentor, Adolf Reed, who, in the last couple of years, in all of his interviews, he always makes a point that the big change for him was the election of Reagan, and that meant putting off the question of the struggle for socialism in favor of fighting against the right. And of course, that's a recapitulation of what happened back in the 1930s, in that era. And so I just wanted to sort of reconnect that theme that came up earlier, that the mistake might have been to accept a defensive posture, rather than looking for new opportunities in the changes of capitalism that were being brought about. I kind of remember at the time, and I feel like we're living through that now, that there was a kind of denial that it was happening. In other words, neoliberalism was voodoo economics. The first Reagan term was a fiasco.
Spitting image.
Oh yeah, spitting image, of course. So there was this idea that actually Reagan and Thatcher didn't know what they were doing, and they were just mucking everything up, and that they were abjectly failing, and that it was all a kind of charade. And it turned out not to be true. So it took the left a very long time to acknowledge that there was a change. Basically, they only acknowledged it maybe 20 years later. And that's another thing that we ought to bear in mind now, right, is that there's a lot of denial of what's going on, what's manifestly happening.
Yeah. I think they acknowledged it, the left acknowledged it by the middle of the 90s, that was the WTO movement was against neoliberalism and globalism. But at that moment, it strange, the schizophrenia around that was, we were struggling against the globalization and the NAFTA and neoliberalism while campaigning sometimes for Clinton, or at least not directly opposing the Democratic Party. The most radical of us were post-leftists. I mean, meaning post-political, like we didn't want to organize at all. No platforms, no politics, just anarchy, man.
The beginning of, really, it was the beginning of something that exploded in the millennial left as well, which is movements without leaders and protests without demands, right? That started in the 90s, and that was what you saw with Black Lives Matter, for example, as one example. Also Occupy Wall Street. Justin?
Hi. Yeah, so if previous questions might have been coming from a place of sober reflection on the missed opportunities of the millennial left, I feel like my question is coming more from a place of tenitic anxiety about the future possibility of a left. I'm kind of running around with my hair on fire here, and I need you guys to use your generational experience as the water bucket. So Luxemburg writes in her Junius pamphlet that all is not lost so long as the proletariat doesn't unlearn how to learn. But as Andony describes well, I think it seems clear to me from the millennial left's anti-Trumpist repetition of the Gen X left's hysterical defense of the status quo contra Reagan, that the left has indeed unlearned how to learn. And perhaps this expresses the fact that the party, which was a form of historical consciousness, such as would let the left even recognize that it failed, is absent. So if Luxemburg was right, then is all lost. How, in that case, to relearn how to learn? And more concretely, what do the 1980s and 2010s moments, which arguably are similar, say about the hope of a renascent Marxism among the Zoomer and later lefts? And will the Zoomer left have a chance, if not of succeeding, then at least of recognizing that it failed? Or might its failure too become institutionalized and come to serve as a model for subsequent regression?
Can I say something to that?
Go ahead, Doug.
Prepare to be bored. Prepare not, this is what I tell my kids, it's not easy, and it's not going to instantly make you feel better to learn about the history of socialism or anything really that you really want to learn. So prepare to be bored sometimes, and for it not to make sense, and for politics to be grueling. That doesn't mean you should accept repeating things that don't make sense. It just means it's not going to be instantaneous. And just because you're young and you come along and you want to change everything doesn't mean you get to. And that's that's all I'll say to that. Well, I feel like a dad, though. But anyway.
Any other generational wisdom? Do you have any?
I said enough.
Yeah, speak to the hair on fire moment.
I think
there is something.
Well, I would say if you were looking to do revolutionary politics now, or maybe revolution is loading too much on, but transformational politics now, I would be looking in the movements of the now. I think militant trade unionism is like a sort of, the minority of a minority of a minority activity. I'm not saying that you should embrace or join, though I've done both those things, populist movements, but obviously populism is the populist thing that's gone on over the last 4 or 5 years is the thing that's happening in politics. Those would be the things that I would be interested in. I was really fascinated by the protests against the vaccine mandates, Those were really wild, and I found myself on a platform with, not exactly a platform, but in a common cause with Piers Corbyn, Jeremy's less intelligent brother. That's cruel, wrong. Less orthodox brother. And I can't say that these were like good or the future or anything like that, but it was actually what was happening. It was not. It worked for 2 years. It was what was happening. I also got a job as a vaccinator, which didn't go down well with the other side. But because these are the things that are happening, and I think that I often think, talking to left wingers, that they are speaking to an almost entirely imaginary world of 1970s activism, which I look for desperately and would be really intrigued to see. And then I see thousands of people marching off in some other direction, doing something that makes literally no sense according to any kind of Marxist precepts or whatever, like the Brexit campaign, or like I was on a march with the Ukrainians. And I can't say I know what the answer is on that whole thing, but it was very moving, kind of struggle these people are involved in that was solidly working class amongst the Ukrainians, but not any kind, it didn't fit any box.
I have one quick comment. That was surprising with Trump, but also was surprising with Reagan, although I was too young to be surprised by it, was how things change. And I guess, watching the millennial left and then being part of the Gen X left, there was this sense that nothing would change, that it would be an interminable, never-changing neoliberalism. It was going to go on for millennia. And then it changed, and everybody was shocked and couldn't process it. The way that Chris described it, it was the same way many of you probably experienced the Trump phenomenon, where it was this like disbelief. And I think that's the element that needs to be grasped from the 80s, is how the 80s was completely shocked and could not pull itself together for a good decade. And even when they did, like when Doug brings up the anti-WTO, it was, if it's maybe forward-looking thing is like the idea of non-state actors, the civil society, so-called civil society, that there would be people, that you would have the people who are sewing the clothes would connect with the consumer in Chicago, which was really never anything. Mm-hmm. So it really was defensive. The anti-WTO stuff was never really about looking for what James has described, where that growing edge is. And I think partly the depression can cause a kind of, stale thought that is very hard to shake, and you can never see what's new.
Thanks. Kevin.
Thanks to all four panelists for what has been a very lively discussion so far, and so my question is addressed to all four panelists. So what you guys have in common with your tendencies on the left in the 1980s is opposition to Stalinism, as marked out in Andony's social democracy, and also the anarchism of Doug and Andony, and also the socialism from below, right, whether in a sort of Cliffite splinter grouping James, and also the International Socialist Organization of Lain. And so my question is, in your guys' opposition to Stalinism in the 1980s and the Second Cold War and going beyond, what insights were you guys able to recover from the Marxism of the Second International? So if Stalinism is coupled together with the legacy of the Third International, then perhaps that's thrown to discard, and we have to consider the Marxism of the Second International, of which Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky were a part of, as with many others, such as Kautsky, Babel, Bernstein, etc. Thank you.
Good question. Lance, did you ever consider the older history?
Did I ever consider what?
The older history,
Yeah.
Debsian socialism, things like that?
Yeah, I mean, no, it was an interesting question because when we talked about the kind of tradition that we stood in, of course, there's Marx and Engels and, the founders of socialism, Marxism, but we also talked about, Lenin, Trotsky, Luxemburg, Gramsci, Mariátegui, the first four congresses of the Communist International. So we do identify with the Third International, but we also know that most of that Third International emerged from the Second International. Right. So so I think that there's a real distinction there in what was in the Second International, and we, I think, sort of everyone in my politics and whatever didn't pay a whole lot of attention to Kautsky. Was sort of thought of him as the Pope of Marxism, whose politics failed in the German social democracy when it voted for war credits and ended the Second International. And I would never have believed that 30 years ago that somebody such as an Eric Blanc or whatever would come back and sort of try to breathe new life into Kautsky in the current period. But that happened. So when people will say, yeah, what do you all read Lenin for, and I go, well, hey, there's a lot of people who go to an even older tradition than that, and we try to make that as something that's relevant today. So anyway, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
James, did your group ever reconsider the Second International?
Well, we always had a rather snidey view of the whole thing, and I think we were right. My view of theory is that it's a great big cupboard, and you can take anything you like, and you don't have to be loyal to any first, second, third, fourth, or fifth international. If it works, it works. Trotskyism was great on the critique of Stalinism in its political sense, but very bad on its analysis of the Stalinist formation that emerged. Nothing in the Second International, really bad.
No old pre-Labor Party, like Social Democratic Federation, no Keira Hardie, no
The
anything?
SDF was quite sectarian, and I've got some old books, by the socialist, what was called the Socialist Labour Party. I liked that they were into anthropology, but that's a crank preoccupation of mine. Enlighten me, I think.
Doug,
yeah,
go ahead.
I started reading any Marx at all after the economic crisis of 2008, and I've read a bunch of stuff and not enough, but I've read some Kautsky, and I've read some other, I've read Marx, and I've read some Lenin, and I think there's something to be gleaned from from learning the history of socialism, but it didn't form my politics in the 80s and 90s. It's something that happened when I think a lot of other people on the left returned to Marx after the economic crisis, and I'm trying to hold on to that moment. Now I'm the conservative trying to hold on to 2008 and that revelation. But anyway.
Wentai.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for all of your time. So my first question is to Lance. I just wanted to ask you to maybe directly respond to, I think, one of the questions Andony raised in his opening remarks, which I will kind of rephrase as, why was the 80s left unable to recognize that although it didn't have to take the form of neoliberalism, the Fordist welfare state, could not go on, and someone was going to have to reconfigure capitalism in the wake of that collapse. So, why did it appear that it was neoliberalism, doing something that was kind of happening anyways? Second question is to Doug. So from the outside, it seems like neoliberalism actually takes this, maybe call it right-wing or opportunistic turn in the late 80s, maybe early 90s. It goes from the extremism, but also the utopianism of Thatcher and Volcker, to Volcker and Thatcher, getting the boot, and in Volcker's case, being replaced by a guy who's the exact opposite of him, i.e., Greenspan. So we went from like subjugating society to the perceived laws of capital, no matter what the costs were, to social welfare. So I'm reminded of, Volcker saying, we need to swallow the pill of painful recession and mass layoffs to rid ourselves of inflation, right? We go from that to like consolidating an administered welfare state and paying lip service now to social welfare. So and to bridge this to what you're saying, it seems like when the left acknowledged neoliberalism, which you said it was in the mid-90s, by that time neoliberalism was like no longer revolutionary. So my question to Doug would be like, did you experience that moment on the left, neoliberalism turning more opportunistic? What was that like? And sorry, my very last question is just to James. James, it sounds like you're telling us, to join the movements of here and now that actually impact the terms of, political discourse today. Obviously, the trucker convoy, in Canada, the America First people who are trying to overthrow the GOP in the US come to mind. So, is that what you're saying? And if so, what does a leftist intervention in those things look like?
So let's start with Lance.
Okay, so if I get, let me make sure I got the question right, is why was the late 80s left unable to realize that what the welfare state was unpopular or something like that? And that it wasn't just neoliberalism that was doing it?
Yeah, meaning that like, I think typically we hear a lot this view that like it's neoliberalism who destroyed the welfare state. It's neoliberalism that chose to, take away all the labor protections of workers and so forth. But if we actually kind of look at how things played out, it seems to me like it's quite obvious that, all of that stuff, the welfare state, those labor protections, Nixon's wage controls, all that stuff, it all comes into objective crisis on its own in the 70s, right, starting in 1973. So like, and it's only then later on that like, incidentally, the people who end up consolidating the crisis and exerting social leadership in that moment, it's incidentally like the neoliberals who do it. But I guess, I think this is one of the things Andony was raising in his opening remarks is like, if things had to change anyways, like why is it that the left just can't see that like there's a crisis, someone's gonna see social responsibility, and instead the left just gives all the historical agency to neoliberalism. Like it's neoliberalism that did all these things.
Right.
Okay. Okay, so let me see if I can answer that. So first off, I think you're right that these systems fell into crisis. The economic crisis, the end of the post-war boom takes place in, the expansion of capitalism from 47 to 73 is unlike anything that happened before it. And this also created a left and a certain expectation of, you could have a good life, labor, you could be a member of a labor union, you wouldn't even have to have a college degree, you could actually raise a family, send your kids to college, things would be always looking forward and expanding. And of course, when that hits 1973, economic crisis, the oil crunch, et cetera, so forth and so on, worst recession in that period up until the early 80s recession that was engineered partly by Volcker, I think it hit a lot of people on the left at that time. Now, I was not officially a member of the left at that time. I was a little too young, but I know from the people that I met and knew in the early ISO, many of whom had been in the IS. At the mid-70s, they had actually determined that they were going to industrialize into key sectors of the industry and organize from within, and they did that right at the time when the employer, the economy hit a wall, layoffs came back, employers were much more forceful, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's actually, to me, that's the explanation as to why the left either didn't grasp exactly what had happened to it initially, but did over the next decade or so. Because it had certain expectations that had built up over a long period of time and over actually a long period of growth and development of the left before it. We also have to remember, just in terms of like this question of like what people thought about the welfare state in their heads, their ideology, that of course there was always, say, I mean, the fact that the New Deal was popular and so forth didn't change the fact that there was racism, right? So there was still that to be conquered, right? That was still there, and the New Deal didn't actually, the New Deal actually sort of accommodated to that. But we also remember at that time in the early 70s, that was the time when business started the mobilization, and a lot of these sort of conservative organizations started that actually put out a whole bunch of the ideology of neoliberalism to shape the way that people thought about things. But I don't think that it would have worked unless it was also connected to an actual increase in class struggle from the employer side, pushing us back. So I don't know if that fully answers the question, or if there's another piece of that question you wanted me to answer, but that's kind of the way I think about it. And I think, you know, the other thing I will say is that I don't know how, I actually went back and read a couple of articles that were pretty key in the British Socialist Workers' Party debate in the late 70s, early 80s about this, about what Thatcherism would mean to the working class. I won't go through all the details, but there was a debate inside the party as to whether you know, the labor movement could sort of rise and kind of push through Thatcherism, or whether there was something that was really significantly a shift, which, by the way, took place almost all under the Labor government before Thatcher came to power. And the side that said it was the decline and fall of the labor movement internally under the Labor government is the side that won out in terms of the debate and the argument about it. Let's see, where was I going with this? Oh, it was that there's not that many people, especially in the American left, that would go back and make that analysis that would say it's the balance of class forces that actually determine what politics is. Too much of the left has been for generations pretty much appended to the Democratic Party. So the Democratic Party's argument was always we couldn't do anything because Reagan was too popular, or it was Reaganism, or whatever. And so like they have that kind of, if you want to call it superstructural argument, whereas I think Marxists have to have a more structural or from below sort of argument. Explanation, I should say.
Thanks. Doug?
Okay, so the question was, when we realized that neoliberalism had occurred, it was in the mid-90s under Clinton, and did we understand, did the left see that was an opportunistic kind of neoliberalism, that it was not the radical kind of neoliberalism that had come in the 80s beforehand? And I would say no. I'm not sure I even understand that difference now. But what I saw it as at the time was a betrayal by the Democratic Party of the left that they were and workers who they were supposed to represent. So, like, you know, people didn't elect Clinton so that he could get rid of welfare. That was not, you know, at least the people on the left who voted for Clinton didn't do it thinking that that was going to be the outcome. And we wanted him to be a peace candidate. People deluded themselves into thinking he wasn't going to repeat what had happened in the Gulf with the Gulf War. That was perceived to be a betrayal, and it was, and I would say that it's only, for me personally, it was only after the economic crisis that I started to think about neoliberalism as something other than a political project, as a reaction to underlying conditions. Was when it broke in 2008 that I could see, oh, this was, you know, coming out of the 1973 crisis, this was something other than just Reagan's badness being expressed in, you know, an anti-working class politics being pushed. It was a reaction to the fundamentals. So that's my answer. It's like, and so now I feel like we are the left might be, at least in this room, might be in a better position than I was in 1995, because we've had the double, whammy. We've gotten the chance to look back. If you're a Gen X leftist, you have the chance to look back at the 80s and see it in a different context because of 2008. And now you can see as it really starts to take hold that there's a new form of capitalism, this whatever it's going to be, this post-neoliberalism, which could be very dangerous. You can start to see that it is arising not because of bad men or women, but it's not because of Le Pen and it's not because of Trump, and it will happen. It's happening in a different way under Biden. It's arising from the same thing that caused neoliberalism to arise. And when capitalism manages itself, the consequences are pretty bad for working people and for most people. So that would be what I'd say.
It came up earlier, Lance mentioned that out of the civil rights movement of the 60s came a new generation of Democratic Party politicians. And Lance flagged the crime bill as being supported by that layer of politicians. It was also welfare reform that was supported by that same layer of politicians. And in fact, they supported Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was their candidate. If we recall, he was the first black president. And he was elected to reform welfare. That was his platform. Right, in other words, the left may not have paid attention to that. I remember a lot of jubilation when Clinton was elected in 1992 after 12 years of Republican presidents. However, if you actually listened to him on the campaign trail, this was what was promised. He did deliver.
Right. But I mean, the same thing was true about Obama. Like if I didn't vote for Obama, okay, I'm sorry, but and because I listened to him, because he was not even the most progressive candidate available. That would have been Mr. Haircut John Edwards, who was pretty big better. Obama told us he wasn't going to be the next New Deal Fordist president that everyone wanted him to be and pretended he was going to be. And so, yeah, but if you ask most leftists when Obama was elected, whether they were disappointed 3 years later or 2 years later, they would all say yes.
Right. Mm-hmm. James?
Well, I don't want to get stuck in one of those terminological disputes.
No, but go ahead.
But the I still don't like neoliberalism as a category, mostly because it elides or it makes an artificial distinction between the Trente Glorieuses and the what followed, and I always felt that it was too much like capitalism somehow started in 1980, as opposed to some time before that. Having said that, obviously it does describe a real shift in the way balance of class forces, says Lance, or institutional arrangements or something like that. But I started with the thesis that the left itself, the International Socialists, came into existence as an organization, at least in part rebelling against the post-war consensus. Right. The importance of rank and fileism. It was very much, it was quite pointedly against the trade union leaders, as it was against the bosses, and they were, the way they looked, they were sharp, they were mods, they were, they were kicking against that old-fashioned Communist Party, Labour Party, solid kind of post-war consensus, and they were part of the rebellion against that. But it was Mrs. Thatcher that saw it through. On another terminological, with a very different kind of meaning. But the tearing up the post-war consensus. I read the Clinton-Blair era up to Obama as distinct again. I mean, I don't want, maybe it's a mistake to make too many categories, but I thought third way was a pretty good self-description of a particular kind of a rhetorical positioning of a, it was like a cut the Gordian knot type political achievement where you would, in the way that Dick Morris said, you've not just got to defeat the Republicans. The way you've got to do it is you've got to defeat your own base. You've got to define this new Democrats as not only different from Republicans, but different from Democrats. A third way was the way that Blair and Brown distilled the meaning of it. And it involved that, I mean, I don't know whether I think it is more than a rhetorical flourish. And on the welfare debate, the slogan I remember was, it's a hand up, not a handout. And that was really important because it was, you were jumping out of the, which everybody intuited was that insofar as it was constituted as the new right versus the old left, the new right always won. It was impossible. There was no way. Dukakis demonstrated this. Neil Kinnock demonstrated this. You could get about a bit more than a third of the vote to rally around old-fashioned welfarist socialism, as we would have it, or old Democrat position. But you would always lose either to Margaret Thatcher or to Ronald Reagan, and they had to jump out of that trap. That's how they thought of it, and they said we've got to. This is the third way. We're not going to go to the left. We're going to make this third way, and maybe all that means is that you get neoliberal economic policies with left-wing people, leftish people in charge. Maybe it's not much more than that, but I think it might be a bit more than that. I think that the institutions of, so let's say, 92 to 2008 are different from those of 1980 to 1992.
Bryce?
Thanks, everyone. So I was struck by a question Adoni raised. Andony, he asked, he posed the question, perhaps side-taking was really the worst mistake the left made in the 80s. And I think I've heard the other speakers as well kind of talk about this was a new moment of polarization and side-taking as sort of like a major activity of the left. I believe in this time period, Tony Cliff in the UK said that all the left can do now is propaganda. So it's like the left makes the takes, and then the left tries to convince everyone else to buy the takes. And I think even when it comes to like civil rights, it's like the real progress materially on in the United States on racial inequality for blacks and Latinos went nowhere. But what the left really tried to do is convince the white working class to feel good about the civil rights movement that was already pretty much dead in its tracks. And so now we're in a time where people are really seriously talking about Will Smith slapped Chris Rock, and the intellectuals and the leftists of our age, like the great minds of our age that went to a lot more college than I did, are writing like giant paragraphs about it, and they're splitting, and they're not even splitting on an even left-right way. It's like some feminists are on Will Smith's side, and some feminists are on Chris Rock's side, and I really don't want to care, but somehow I've been forced to. And and then there's Ukraine. The DSA has experienced a major split in the United States over the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. And it's like, but there was a time, I think in the 70s, where the left didn't pick a side between Israel and Palestine, but actually said, we support the workers reaching across racial and sectarian lines or ethnic and sectarian lines and overthrowing the ruling class. Not, now it's like choose your fighter, Israel or Palestine. But it also feels like, can the left avoid, because even in Platypus we've had debates about Trump and occasional hurt feelings about this stuff, and about the issues of our time. And it's like, can we avoid side taking and still be politically serious. And that's one other note that was interesting. James mentioned solidarity. So I really followed the trucker convoy. Like, I just watched the whole thing on live stream for like a month because I was unemployed. And one of the main leaders of that movement was a Catholic priest from Poland who was a leader in solidarity. And like, I can tell you, like, this trucker convoy movement, from having organized and studied the theory of nonviolent direct action, was probably the greatest nonviolent direct action movement in human history. Like, they held the line in Ottawa in 0 degrees. Like, and every like club-wielding goon the Canadian state could bring. And they held out for 72 hours, just like this, and they're just like singing the Canadian anthem, just like, oh, Canada, and just like taking the clubs, like in the, like if anyone's seen the movie Gandhi, which came out in the 80s, it was like that. And it was multiracial. There were Native Canadians there, which doesn't get talked about. But, you know, and that father, I'm forgetting his name, but he's Polish. He's anti-gay and an Islamophobe. But he was arrested 15 times by the Canadian police for feeding homeless people, for the crime of feeding homeless people outside. And I'm like, well, all the gay and or Muslim homeless people that were condemned to die by the state would at least get food from this bigot. And I became homeless due to pandemic-related unemployment. And I'd get these automated calls from the state of Kentucky. Sorry, we didn't get, all our specialists are busy, but we'll call you back and we'll get to you. And well, they never did. I got that call for a year. And it's like, so I guess my point is it's hard not to take sides because, like, part of me hates the lockdown liberals now because I feel like they stabbed me in the back. And an old, bigoted, anti-communist priest who stands for everything I'm against, he would have fed me. And maybe I agree with him more than I do with the left in a lot of ways. And that's, you know, that's confusing. So anyways, thanks, everyone.
Nice praise.
Conrad.
Could I just respond, James, there? Could I take you up on that offer?
Of course.
Okay, if you guys want to close.
Go ahead,
thank
Conrad.
you. And I apologize for everyone. I just, you know, I wanted to bring it up when you were talking about Brexit again, because I just see, I think, certain limitations in terms of the arguments you're making. I mean, you said that people should be governed from, you know, by representatives from the place where they're from, right? As if the nation itself is not an arbitrary political construct, right? You know, you said the people, you know, the people's voice must be respected, right? As if people en masse sometimes don't choose things which are absolutely atrocious, right?
Sorry, as if?
As if people themselves don't, you know, the majority of people don't choose things which are deeply undesirable sometimes for themselves or others, right? And I think, in a way, you know, part of the problem here, I mean, I think it goes back, in a way, to sort of the RCP spiked thing. I mean, you talked about sort of how freeing it was, right? That RCP could unburden itself from history. But this wasn't just history that RCP was unburdening itself from. It was movements all over the world that were actually going on, and in many cases, you know, represented governments in those areas. And I think what kind of arises in that context is a sort of mentality of sort of a kind of aestheticization of activism, a sort of aesthetic adventurism, which I think was very, very characteristic of the RCP. And having severed ties with anything like, you know, international organizations, having lost that solidarity, it was very natural that you had the sort of turn with spiked, right? In the 90s, where they said, well, class war is sort of over, right? You know, and that sort of opened the floodgates for all kinds of reactionary positions to be adopted. I mean, if you'd been paying attention at that time, you would have noticed that class war wasn't over, right? You know, there were still all kinds of communist governments in Asia. There were still guerrilla movements, right, in places like India and Philippines, right? Quite aside from the sort of Fukuyamist idea of the end of history, which was, I think, more or less accepted by Spiked in a way in that period. But you know, I mean, when you go in that direction, you know, I think it's very, very natural that you end up in the kind of position you're in, right, where you're kind of like, you know, oh yeah, you know, like any kind of movement out there, you know, that's kind of fun and exciting, we should do that, right? But I think what's really being lost there is the scientific content of Marxist analysis, and the way that it has been at the center of popular movements that have transformed human history, I mean, even in the 20th and 19th centuries, in ways that are without precedent, right, in the history of humankind. And I think the specialness of that and the uniqueness of that, right, I don't think they can be lumped together or conflated with any kind of fashionable movement that comes along, right? So I just wondered if you had a response to that, or I didn't wish to come off too harsh, but
No,
I couldn't pass over it in silence.
Good.
James?
So, do you have a response?
No, I think you're wrong. I think that I think when I say there is no higher value than the people's choice, that's what I mean. And I think you're absolutely right that the people often choose things that are wrong. Like if you had a referendum for the death penalty in Britain, we'd probably choose the death penalty, and I would campaign against that in that referendum. But I think that there's a reason why democracy is the best thing ever, which is that if you can get things wrong, then it's possible for you to get them right. But if an elite subverts your decision-making power and does right on your behalf, then you will always be wrong, because you will never be involved in the decision-making process. And I consider it fundamental to the Marxist project that it's about putting the majority of people in power. I don't think it's any other thing than what the workers' movement ever was, which was power to the people. It was always about the majority of society, the working class, being in control. It's all about workers' control. And any movement that presumes to say that the democratic decision of the masses can be overturned by a clique or a bureaucracy or anything like that is headed to disaster, because it's thrown away the only resource that has the power to make social transformation. That resource is the mass of people. So I think that's absolutely wrong. As to, I mean, I don't want to defend the entire history of Spiked and RCP and all the rest of it, because many of us were involved in that. But I'm pretty confident we were right on everything. Every single thing, even the ones we were wrong on. It was exactly right that the working class movement of the working class of the 1990s and early noughties was massively different from the working class of the 1970s and the 1980s. And you can read that in the strike records, you can read that in the basic social organisation. There was a spectacular difference that we characterised as the point where there was no struggle for leadership, there was no potential to build any kind of vanguard movement in that context. And it's because I don't want to lie about the fact that the category of working class that arose out of a different experience no longer applied in the next experience, that there was no conscious, no working class with any sense of itself as a class. That's why I am open to the fact that real change doesn't happen to fulfill the categories in your head. You know, it's not that the working class, when the working class did, in a definitive way, impose itself upon, momentarily, but certainly, the actual trajectory of British politics, it voted Brexit. That was the biggest shock to elite organisation the entirety of the capitalist class was on the side of Remain. Every leading newspaper, the front benches of both parties, all the banks, all the industrialists, they were all for against Brexit. The working class noticed that they'd been handed this trigger that they could blow the whole thing up, and they pressed that button. Now, I think, as it happens, they're right on the specifics of should you be in or should you be out of the EU. But nonetheless, there's no doubt whatsoever that this was a working class revolt. It had no socialist content, it had no Marxist motivation, it wasn't a Lexit, much as I might wish that be, but nonetheless it was a working class revolt against the status quo. And you can see that because the statistics on it are overwhelmingly the case. The richer you were, the more likely you were to vote Remain, and the poorer you were, the more likely you were to vote Brexit. It was a class divide as clear as the nose on your face. And I cannot understand for the life of me why it is that people want to tell me off about the working class. The one point when the working class makes an intervention in political life, that's the one point that you run away. I don't get it.
Okay.
Thanks for the answer.
Let's adjourn for this evening. Thank you.